So when we talk about prison growth and why we are where we are today, you generally hear three stories, or at least I always do. It's the war on drugs, it's longer sentences, and it's this weird amorphously defined prison industrial complex. These are all factors. They're not irrelevant, but they're not actually the things that really matter. It's not drugs, it's violence. It's not time served, it's admissions. It's not the private industrial prison complex, it's the public industrial prison context. Yet despite this, almost all of our reforms focus on drug sentence length and the private sector, not violence, prosecutors, and the public sector. So I want to explain where we are wrong. I think there are ways you can fix this, but again, that's the happy part. I'm not going to get to that now. So let's start with drugs. How many people here, actually, it's a good question, think that about half of all people in prison are in prison for drugs as their offense? All right. So in a recent Vox survey of 2,000 people, 60% of Americans said they thought the percent was half. A majority of people across all political stripes. In state prisons, it's 16%. Add in the feds, it comes to a grand total of 20%. It's not 50. It's 50% of the feds. They are half of all federal prisoners, but the feds are 10% in the system. The states are 90%, and it's 16% in the states. It is not the main driver of incarceration. In fact, if you look at what's caused prison to grow, is locking up people for violent crimes. 52% of all people in state prison are in prison for a violent crime. And 60% of all prison growth over the past 30 years has come from locking people up for violent offenses. That's where the growth is. Now, why do we get this so fundamentally wrong? Part of it is we've seen the biggest jump in people in prison for drug offenses compared to violent crimes, but that percent change reflects the fact they're not important, not that they are important. But it seems like you've seen the biggest increase in people for drug offenses from something incredibly small to something still small, but the percent change is big, and it makes it look more important than it is. The federal system, despite being 10% of the total population, gets about 95% of the media attention. And the feds do lock people up for drugs and lock them for long periods of time. And people tend to think what goes on the feds is just what happens, but it's not. It's uniquely idiosyncratic. In fact, I would imagine the two states that are most different when it comes to criminal justice, and compare them to each other, they have more in common with each other than any state has in common with the feds. They're just weird for explicable but depressing reasons. So it's violence. It's not drugs. Now, you might argue the fact that that's too narrow a view, right? To say, well, when I say 60% in prison are in prison for drugs, that's just saying people who are locked up for drugs, right? The person who gets killed in a drug deal gone bad, that's not a drug crime, that's a violent crime. The person who steals because prohibition makes drugs more expensive, that's a property crime, not a drug crime. Right? So maybe when I say, well, it's not the war on drugs, well, that's because I'm counting the wrong thing. When I ought to be counting those violent crimes and those drug crimes, I'm missing the property crimes, I'm missing what's going on. Not exactly clear that's true either, right? So to start with, our murder rate actually peaked in 1979, right? Before the war on drugs, such as it is, kicked off. And to be clear, there's actually no precise date when the war on drugs starts. And you'll hear Nixon, you'll hear Reagan, both those are wrong. It varies state by state. New York's war on drugs started in 1973, but everyone ignored it until 84, right? Rockefeller drug laws are passed in 73, but people in prison will go up until 84, right? So 12 years of Rockefeller drug laws and no change in people in prison for drugs, right? It's a very difficult story to actually tell what the war on drugs is. But the fact is murder actually peaked before the war on drugs really started. The total number of deaths peaked in 91, incarceration, murder rate peaked in 79. A recent book by Julie Yovey called Ghettocide points out that in many ways our view of that drugs brings violence gets causation backwards. Drug markets come to where the violence is. It's not that drugs bring violence in their wake. There's some of it, but it's not entirely the case. If we were to not have prohibition, some crimes would go away and other crimes would go up. We'd have fewer drug-related murders. We'd have more domestic disputes ending in death because of drug abuse. We'd have fewer people stealing money to buy drugs. We'd have more people getting busted for driving under the influence of heroin. Right? And so it's unclear in the end how these things balance out. There probably would be less crime and therefore less imprisonment without prohibition, but not to the extent that sort of looking at how many are in prison for these various crimes would tell us, because a lot of these crimes that happen because of drugs would happen because of other reasons, or this person wouldn't be in prison for stealing for drugs, but this other person would be in prison for a DUI for heroin that they're not doing right now. Right? So the total number of people in prison, if we didn't have prohibition, would not be quite as small as you would think compared to where it is today, because legalization brings in its wake all sorts of problems. And to the extent we look at prohibition, capital P prohibition, and all the rise in murder that happened there, two problems with that story. One is that we were urbanizing at the time, right? So things were getting violent just because cities are more violent than rural areas, and prohibition in the 10s and the 20s saw mass immigration into the cities. Also, more frustrating, more police departments were reporting murder during that time. Right? So you just had better reporting. We tracked murders better over the course of prohibition. So murder rate went up because we simply had more data on murders. B, for anything to really happen, legalizing marijuana will do nothing. 1% of prison is in prison for marijuana. 1%. are on marijuana charges. Almost no one's in prison for marijuana. And that's all we're talking about legalizing, right? If you want to get people out of prison, 60 or some percent of those who are in prison for drugs are there for crack, cocaine, a smaller fraction are in there for heroin, right? That's what you have to legalize. You actually want to get people out of prison for these kinds of issues. And that's not, maybe that's a discussion we should be having, right? But that's not where we can barely tolerate the idea of legalizing marijuana. Moving on to heroin and crack is a completely different question to start having. So if we are going to cut our prison populations back, we have to start asking how we're going to treat people convicted of violent crimes differently. And I point out that mistake I just made is one I make all the time, and I fight actively against every day. Violent offenders. It starts to show why this is so hard. Right? That's the wrong word to use. These are not violent offenders. They are people who have committed violent crimes. Right? And using the word violent offenders makes it sound like it's a permanent static condition. That if you commit a violent crime, you are and always shall be a violent person. You are a violent offender. Except for the giant stacks of evidence up to here showing people age in and out of violent behavior altogether. Right? Young people are more violent, then you become increasingly violent, then you get older and you age out of violence, then sometimes you hit your 70s, hormone levels shift again and become violent once more. Which is actually why, that's actually why some people, there are men and old folks who actually become increasingly aggressive when they're in their 70s. It is due to these hormone shifts that explain the same shifts going on when they were 20. The hormone shifts revert back again when they're in their 70s. Right? It's a very biological factor to it. We have to focus on violent offenders. Yet in that same Vox poll that found that 60% of Americans did not believe that half of all people were in prison for drugs, that same survey found that 60% of Americans, including 55% of liberals to 65% of conservatives, do not want to reduce sentence lengths for violent offenders, even those who pose no risk of future offending. Right? The very thing we have to do, change the way we punish people convicted of violence, is one thing that no one of any political ideology is willing to do at this point. So that's the first big challenge we have to face. Is at some point we have to say the easy, non-violent, low-level cases aren't going to get us there. And it's not even just like start with the low-hanging fruit, because we throw the violent crimes under the bus, they pass the other reforms. Right? How do states pass the reforms of drug laws? They jack up their sanctions for people convicted of violence. So South Carolina did it. It's how Maryland did it. That's the rhetoric of it. Right? So we save it for those we are scared of, those who are a threat, those who are dangerous. Negates our ability to actually reform where we have to reform going down the line. The second big thing people say it is that causes prison growth are longer sentences. Everyone's in prison for these massively long sentences. They're just rotting away in prison. The median time spent in prison by someone convicted of a drug or a property offense is 1.1 year, 6 months. The median time spent in prison by someone convicted of violent crime is 3 years. That's how long people spend in prison. 1.5 to 3 years on average. Now, there are people who spend 10, 15, 20 years in prison, but the fact is, if you look at everyone admitted to prison in 2003, the number still in prison at the end of 2013, 11 years later, the percent of those who have never been released from prison once in 13 years was 3% of those admitted in 2003. I'm really behind. Okay. We have these tougher laws, but people aren't actually being sent to prison for that length of time. What is driving prison growth more than anything else is an increased willingness on the part of prosecutors to send people to prison in the first place. The number of arrests since 1991 has gone down. So we have fewer crimes and fewer people being arrested for crimes. The total number entering the criminal justice system has fallen. And during that same period of time, the number of felony cases filed in state court rose by about 40%. Fewer and fewer people going in, more and more people being filed with felony charges. Once a felony charge is filed against you, the probability you go to prison has stayed flat. Once you go to prison, time spent in prison has stayed flat. So at least since crime started dropping in the 90s, the single biggest driver of prison growth is in the increased willingness of the prosecutor to take an arrest and turn it into a felony case. Now, if you look at every reform bill that's been passed nationwide so far, I can tell you exactly how many of them have actually directly targeted this kind of prosecutorial discretion. None. Not a single one. Not a single state is willing to look at the power prosecutors have. Not a single state has sought to regulate it directly. No, it's not even part of their reform discussion. They're not even discussed really at all. There are lots of different reasons, I think, for this, why this has happened, but we don't really know why, because remarkably, prosecutors provide no data whatsoever. We have the Uniform Crime Reports on crime, the National Crime Victimization Survey on crime. We have multiple prisoner data sets. We have literally no data on what prosecutors do. Absolutely none. And so we're flying blind. We know they drive it. We have no idea what they do, why they do it, how they do it, what their goals are, what their internal policies are, what even just internal, like what drives their decision making. But they are at the center of this entire process. That's not to say longer sentences don't matter, right? Because the Supreme Court says you can threaten anything you want during a plea bargain deal, short of death. As long as you don't invoke death, you're allowed to impose any threat you want. Life without parole or 3 years, that's a perfectly valid threat to make during a plea bargain. So as they create these longer and longer sentences, that certainly gives, the DAs go from showing up to a fight with a knife, now they come with a nuclear bomb. That makes things easier, but they're still aiming for those same short sentences, just grinding more people through for these short periods of time. The last thing to think about is the private prison debate. You hear this a lot, right? The first thing Bernie Sanders did when he wanted to show that he cared about crime was to pass a clearly unconstitutional bill to ban private prisons everywhere. Can't tell the states what to do, but he was trying to make a gesture. Hillary Clinton immediately returned all of her private prison money as soon as people made clear she was getting it, despite the fact that about 6% of all prisoners are in private. 6% of state prisoners are in private prisons. 8% nationwide are in private prisons. It is a vanishingly small fraction of what's going on. More important, the real power doesn't rest with the private prisons. It rests with the public sector, right? There's no evidence that states with private prisons grow any faster than states without. Most private prisons are only in a handful of states. Those states are not necessarily fast-growing states. Some of them are shrinking states. But the public sector unions, that's really where the power happens to rest. Right? New York State has had one of the longest sustained decarcerations in American history. Since 1989, New York State's prison population has dropped by about 25-30%. Right? It went from 75,000 to 55,000 people in prison. No one talks about it. We didn't pass any big bills, but steady from 1999 to today, we've said we dropped prisoners. Yet we cannot close prisons because the New York State Prison Guard Union keeps them open. And if you want to save money on prisons, you have to realize you don't save anything until you start laying off prison guards. 50 to 75% of all spending on corrections goes to salary. It's very cheap to run a prison. But if you can't lay off a guard, you save nothing. Pennsylvania closed 2 prisons, laid off 3 guards. 3 guards. Right? Those are the 3 most effective guards in penological history. They ran 2 prisons between them. Or they're very, very good at blocking this. Michigan closed. Michigan's in the process of closing one of its biggest prisons. Yet the article in the Detroit paper made it very clear that the union they're holding off talking about layoffs until a later date. Right? Which means they're not going to lay one off. They're going to reallocate them somewhere else, and all the savings are going to disappear. At every turn, the prison guard union, public sector unions outmaneuver the private prisons. When they go head-to-head, the private prisons lose every single time. Not to mention that the legislators themselves have strong incentives to keep things tough. As I'm almost out of time, I'll give one clear example of the way in which the public sector cares in a way you can't even see. Outside of 4 states, including this one, the census. Where does a prisoner live when it comes time for a census? They live where they come from, in the urban county, or they live where they're housed in the rural county. Outside of 4 states, they live in that rural county. Transferring 1.5 million people, mostly from the cities, to the rural areas. In some states, that keeps your seat. There are 5 or 6 state senators in Pennsylvania who, if they lost their prisons, would lose their seats to redistricting. All right? There's one small town district in Iowa, the worst case. Most districts have 1,500 people per district. This one has a prison and 40 people. The alderman for that district wins with 2 votes every year, right? Because 1,000 people in this district can't vote in a 1,500-person district. Don't oversell it, right? In New York State, the largest prison is 3,000 people, and an alderman's district is 150,000, plus we don't count that way in New York anymore. We're one of 4 states that doesn't. But you have to realize that there's all these insidious ways in which the public sector plays a much bigger role. So with those depressing comments, I will stop. There are solutions to all these things. We should realize that we don't actually talk about them at all, and that's a huge problem that we face.
Katherine, Massey Book Club, Context of White Supremacy. Gus T. Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the global system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, May 29, 2026. So I have been told this is our 7th installment on Lion, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness. We are picking up the subsection in defense of all white juries. Now, we started that section last week. We just didn't get to complete it, so we will do that today right at the very beginning. One, the music that we have been listening to throughout this study session has been very intentional. The deliberate nature of our selections continues today with Breaking Bad, fallacies, lots of those in this book. The audio segment that we started with, that is White Man Suspected Racist, unless I'm misinformed, John Paff. His spelling is P-F-A-F-F. He gave a talk a little less than 15 years ago. He also wrote the book Locked In, which is on the exact same subject matter. And Mr. Paff, he has been one of the many vocal critics who pointed out the fallacies with Michelle Alexander's numbers that we heard last week, or the massive correction or revisement, whatever you want to call it, where in the original publication, she said that about a third of prisoners are violent offenders. And then she moved it up to about 52%. for the 2020 publication without any explanation, without, did you get new information? None of that. And I said that is very dishonest. Mr. Paff was one of the folks who called that out from the original publication. As I said, he wrote the book Locked In. I think he talks about some of that in the book. I have not read that one. I thought it was important. He talked about the discrepancies with regards to when the war on drugs starts, going even back to the Rockefeller laws and all that. Hey, white people are always about locking up black people for whatever the justification. He gave the same numbers in terms of about 52% of the people that are in prisons in the U.S. are there for violent offenses, and why that's important, because it totally obliterates the notion that really of this book. That's the core argument of this book, that we have so many people in greater confinement, and particularly black males, because of the war on drugs. And Mr. Paff says, no, that's not true. In fact, he says, hey, it's about 1% of the current prison population is there for cannabis exclusively, and saying that if we push that narrative that all we need to do is change these drug laws and legalize, make cannabis legal and recreational and all the rest of it, maybe legalize all the drugs too, that doesn't really get to the core of the problem. And that was something that I was saying years ago when they first started talking about cannabis legalization, that I just don't think that gets to the root of replacing white supremacy with justice. He also importantly talked about one of the things that would make a difference, reining in some of that prosecutorial discretion. Now that is oh my goodness, I don't have no knowledge of jurisprudence, but I have talked about the discretion from mostly white prosecutors. Now, he didn't include that. Most of the prosecutors are white. That is massive when you can do whatever you want. That means you can dismiss a case for whatever reason you want. You can bring charges for whatever reason you want. You can, hey, you're going to be charged with a felony, Leroy. All of that is up to you. And what the jury composition looks like, you have so much power, discretion as a white prosecutor, really anywhere in the world, but we're talking about the U.S. It is, and that's not something that they talk about changing at all. Quickly, they said that 50 to 75% of prison funding goes for salaries. I had a big smile. Dr. Kamal Kamban, he called this white welfare all the time. And so you got these no count, incompetent, unqualified whites, race soldiers. This is all they can do. Go get a nigger knocker and boss black people around and keep them caged. Really, even Alligator Alcatraz, so-called, these concentration camps that they got, same thing. And then they talked about the same resistance to reforming, stopping all this caging, greater confinement. They said, hey, we get our congressional seats and all that. We get political offices based on population numbers, and particularly we have these big populations of prisons, people who are in confinement and they cannot vote, but it swells our population rolls, so we get more political representation. Whoopee for us. James Lowen talked about this as well, where a lot of these so-called sundown towns, they don't even have a large population, and they don't even have resources. They don't have industry. They don't have anything. All they have is a small town of whites, racists, and a prison of niggers. Racially restricted regions. And with that, we will go ahead and push off. Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Katherine Massey Book Club, audio segment 1.
Fallacies, 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 fallacies.
Given how flagrantly prosecutors were violating Batson's ban on race discrimination in jury selection, it was reasonable to hope that if presented with a particularly repugnant case, the Supreme Court might be willing to draw the line at practices that make a mockery of the anti-discrimination principle. Granted, the court had been unwilling to accept statistical proof of race discrimination in sentencing in McCleskey, and it had brushed off concerns of racial bias in discretionary police stops in Wren, and it had granted virtual immunity to prosecutors in their charging decisions in Armstrong. But would it go so far as to allow prosecutors to offer blatantly absurd, downright laughable excuses for striking blacks from juries? It turns out the answer was yes. In Perkett v. Elm in 1995, the Supreme Court ruled that any race-neutral reason, no matter how silly, ridiculous, or superstitious, is enough to satisfy the prosecutor's burden of showing that a pattern of striking a particular racial group is not, in fact, based on race. In that case, the prosecutor offered the following explanation to justify his strikes of black jurors. I struck juror number 22 because of his long hair. He had long curly hair. He had the longest hair of anybody on the panel by far. He appeared not to be a good juror for that fact. Also, he had a mustache and a goatee-type beard. And juror number 24 also had a mustache and goatee-type beard. And I don't like the way they looked, with the way the hair is cut, both of them. And the mustaches and the beards look suspicious to me. The Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit ruled that the foregoing explanation for the prosecutor's strikes of black jurors was insufficient and should have been rejected by the trial court because long hair and facial hair are not plausibly related to a person's ability to perform as a juror. The appellate court explained, where the prosecution strikes a prospective juror who is a member of the defendant's racial group solely on the basis of factors which are facially irrelevant to the question of whether that person is qualified to serve as a juror in the particular case, the prosecution must at least articulate some plausible race-neutral reason for believing that those factors will somehow affect the person's ability to perform his or her duties as a juror. The U.S. Supreme Court reversed, holding that when a pattern of race-based strikes has been identified by the defense, the prosecutor need not provide an explanation that is persuasive or even plausible. Once the reason is offered, a trial judge may choose to believe or disbelieve any silly or superstitious reason offered by prosecutors to explain a pattern of strikes that appear to be based on race. The court sent a clear message that appellate courts are largely free to accept the reasons offered by a prosecutor for excluding prospective black jurors, no matter how irrational or absurd the reasons may seem. The occupation, policing the enemy. The court's blind eye to race discrimination in the criminal justice system has been especially problematic in policing. Racial bias is most acute at the point of entry into the system for two reasons: discretion and authorization. Although prosecutors as a group have the greatest power in the criminal justice system, police have the greatest discretion. Discretion that is amplified in drug law enforcement. And unbeknownst to the general public, the Supreme Court has actually authorized race discrimination in policing, rather than adopting legal rules banning it. Racially biased police discretion is key to understanding how the overwhelming majority of people who get swept into the criminal justice system in the war on drugs turn out to be black or brown, even though the police adamantly deny that they engage in racial profiling. In the drug war, police have discretion regarding whom to target, which individuals, as well as where to target, which neighborhoods or communities. As noted earlier, at least 10% of Americans violate drug laws every year, and people of all races engage in illegal drug activity at similar rates. With such an extraordinarily large population of offenders to choose from, decisions must be made regarding who should be targeted and where the drug war should be waged. From the outset, the drug war could have been waged primarily in overwhelmingly white suburbs or on college campuses. SWAT teams could have rappelled from helicopters in gated suburban communities and raided the homes of high school lacrosse players, known for hosting coke and ecstasy parties after their games. The police could have seized televisions, furniture, and cash from fraternity houses based on an anonymous tip that a few joints or a stash of cocaine could be found hidden in someone's dresser drawer. Suburban homemakers could have been placed under surveillance and subjected to undercover operations designed to catch them violating laws regulating the use and sale of prescription uppers. All of this could have happened as a matter of routine in white communities, but it did not. Instead, when police go looking for drugs, they look in the hood. Tactics that would be political suicide in an upscale white suburb are not even newsworthy in poor black and brown communities. So long as mass drug arrests are concentrated in impoverished urban areas, police chiefs have little reason to fear a political backlash, no matter how aggressive and warlike the efforts may be. And so long as the number of drug arrests increases, or at least remains high, federal dollars continue to flow in and fill the department's coffers. As one former prosecutor put it, it's a lot easier to go out to the hood, so to speak, and pick somebody than to put your resources in an undercover operation in a community where there are potentially politically powerful people. The hyper-segregation of the black poor in ghetto communities has made the roundup easy. Confined to ghetto areas and lacking political power, the black poor are convenient targets. Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton's book, American Apartheid, documents how racially segregated ghettos were deliberately created by federal policy, not impersonal market forces or private housing choices. The enduring racial isolation of the ghetto poor has made them uniquely vulnerable in the war on drugs. What happens to them does not directly affect and is scarcely noticed by the privileged beyond the ghetto's invisible walls. Thus it is here, in the poverty-stricken, racially segregated ghettos, where the war on poverty has been abandoned and factories have disappeared, that the drug war has been waged with the greatest ferocity. SWAT teams are deployed here. Buy and bust operations are concentrated here. Drug raids of apartment buildings occur here. Stop and frisk operations occur on the streets here. Black and brown youth are the primary targets. It is not uncommon for a young black teenager living in a ghetto community to be stopped, interrogated, and frisked numerous times in the course of a month, or even a single week, often by paramilitary units. Studies of racial profiling typically report the total number of people stopped and searched, desegregated by race. These studies have led some policing experts to conclude that racial profiling is actually worse in white communities because the racial disparities in stop and search rates are much greater there. What these studies do not reveal, however, is the frequency with which any given individual is likely to be stopped in specific, racially defined neighborhoods. The militarized nature of law enforcement in ghetto communities has inspired rap artists and black youth to refer to the police presence in black communities as the occupation. In these occupied territories, many black youth automatically assume the position when a patrol car pulls up, knowing full well that they will be detained and frisked no matter what. This dynamic often comes as a surprise to those who have spent little time in ghettos. Craig Futterman, a law professor at the University of Chicago, reports that his students frequently express shock and dismay when they venture into those communities for the first time and witness the distance between abstract legal principles and actual practice. One student reported following her ride along with Chicago police, "Each time we drove into a public housing project and stopped the car, every young black man in the area would almost reflexively place his hands up against the car and spread his legs to be searched, and the officers would search them. The officers would then get back in the car and stop in another project, and this would happen again. This repeated itself throughout the entire day. I couldn't believe it. This was nothing like we learned in law school, but it just seemed so normal for the police and the young men." Numerous scholars and many law enforcement officials attempt to justify the concentration of drug law enforcement resources in ghetto communities on the grounds that it's easier for the police to combat illegal drug activity there. The theory is that black and Latino drug users are more likely than white users to obtain illegal drugs in public spaces that are visible to the police, and therefore it is more efficient and convenient for the police to concentrate their efforts on open-air drug markets in ghetto communities. Sociologists have been major proponents of this line of reasoning, pointing out that differential access to private space influences the likelihood that criminal behavior will be detected. Because poor people lack access to private space, often sharing small apartments with numerous family members or relatives, their criminal activity is more likely to be conducted outdoors. Concentrating law enforcement efforts in locations where drug activity will be more easily detected is viewed as a race-neutral organizational necessity. This argument is often buttressed by claims that most citizen complaints about illegal drug activity come from ghetto areas, and that the violence associated with the drug trade occurs in inner cities. These facts, drug war defenders claim, make the decision to wage the drug war almost exclusively in poor communities of color an easy and logical choice. This line of reasoning is weaker than it initially appears. Many law enforcement officials acknowledge that the demand for illegal drugs is so great, and the lack of alternative sources of income so few in ghetto communities, that if you take one dealer off the street, he'll be replaced within an hour. Many also admit that a predictable consequence of breaking up one drug ring is a slew of violence as others fight for control of the previously stabilized market. These realities suggest, if the past 2 decades of endless war somehow did not, that the drug war is doomed to fail. They also call into question the legitimacy of convenience as an excuse for the mass imprisonment of black and brown men in ghetto communities. Even putting aside such concerns, though, recent research indicates that the basic assumptions upon which drug war defenses typically rest are simply wrong. The conventional wisdom that get-tough tactics are a regrettable necessity in poor communities of color, and that efficiency requires the drug war to be waged in the most vulnerable neighborhoods, turns out to be, as many have long suspected, nothing more than wartime propaganda, not sound policy. Unconventional wisdom. In 2002, a team of researchers at the University of Washington decided to take the defenses of the drug war seriously by subjecting the arguments to empirical testing in a major study of drug law enforcement in a racially mixed city, Seattle. The study found that, contrary to the prevailing common sense, the high arrest rates of African Americans in drug law enforcement could not be explained by rates of offending, nor could they be explained by other standard excuses, such as the ease and efficiency of policing open-air drug markets, citizen complaints, crime rates, or drug-related violence. The study also debunked the assumption that white drug dealers deal indoors, making their criminal activity more difficult to detect. The authors found that it was untrue stereotypes about crack markets, crack dealers, and crack babies, not facts, that were driving discretionary decision-making by the Seattle Police Department. The facts were as follows. Seattle residents were far more likely to report suspected narcotics activities in residences, not outdoors, but police devoted their resources to open-air drug markets and to the one precinct that was least likely to be identified as the site of suspected drug activity in citizen complaints. In fact, although hundreds of outdoor drug transactions were recorded in predominantly white areas of Seattle, police concentrated their drug enforcement efforts in one downtown drug market where the frequency of drug transactions was much lower. In racially mixed open-air drug markets, black dealers were far more likely to be arrested than whites, even though white dealers were present and visible. And the department focused overwhelmingly on crack, the one drug in Seattle more likely to be sold by African Americans, despite the fact that local hospital records indicated that overdose deaths involving heroin were more numerous than all overdose deaths for crack and powder cocaine combined. local police acknowledged that no significant level of violence was associated with crack in Seattle, and that other drugs were causing more hospitalizations, but steadfastly maintained that their deployment decisions were non-discriminatory. The study's authors concluded, based on their review and analysis of the empirical evidence, that the Seattle Police Department's decisions to focus so heavily on crack to the near exclusion of other drugs, and to concentrate its efforts on outdoor drug markets in downtown areas rather than drug markets located indoors or in predominantly white communities, reflect a racialized conception of the drug problem. As the authors put it, the Seattle Police Department's focus on Black and Latino individuals and on the drug most strongly associated with blackness suggests that law enforcement policies and practices are predicated on the assumption that the drug problem is, in fact, a Black and Latino one, and that crack, the drug most strongly associated with urban blacks, is the worst. This racialized cultural script about who and what constitutes the drug problem renders illegal drug activity by whites invisible. White people, the study's authors observed, are simply not perceived as drug offenders by Seattle police officers. Hollow hope. One might imagine that the facts described above would provide grounds for a lawsuit challenging the Seattle Police Department's drug war tactics as a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and demanding reform. After all, obtaining reform through the city council or state legislature may seem unlikely, for black criminals are perhaps the most despised minority in the U.S. population. Few politicians will leap at the opportunity to support black people labeled criminals. Accordingly, a lawsuit may seem like the best option. The purpose of our Constitution, especially the 14th Amendment's equal protection guarantee, is to protect minority rights even when, or especially when, they are unpopular. So shouldn't African American defendants be able to file a successful lawsuit demanding an end to these discriminatory practices, or challenge their drug arrests on the grounds that these law enforcement practices are unlawfully tainted by race? The answer is yes, they should. But no, they probably can't. As legal scholar David Cole has observed, the court has imposed nearly insurmountable barriers to persons challenging race discrimination at all stages of the criminal justice system. The barriers are so high that few lawsuits are even filed, notwithstanding shocking and indefensible racial disparities. Procedural hurdles, such as the standing requirement, have made it virtually impossible to seek reform of law enforcement agencies through the judicial process, even when the policies or practices at issue are illegal or plainly discriminatory. Adolph Lyons' attempt to ban the use of lethal chokeholds by the Los Angeles Police Department is a good example. Lyons, a 24-year-old black man, was driving his car in Los Angeles one morning when he was pulled over by 4 police officers for a burned-out taillight. With guns drawn, police ordered Lyons out of his car. He obeyed. The officers told him to face the car, spread his legs, and put his hands on his head. Again, Lyons did as he was told. After the officers completed a pat-down, Lyons dropped his hands, prompting an officer to slam Lyons's hands back on his head. When Lyons complained that the car keys he was holding were causing him pain, the officer forced Lyons into a chokehold. He lost consciousness and collapsed. When he awoke, he was spitting up blood and dirt, had urinated and defecated, and had suffered permanent damage to his larynx. The officers issued a traffic ticket for the burned-out taillight and released him. Lyons sued the city of Los Angeles for violation of his constitutional rights and sought as a remedy a ban against future use of the chokeholds. By the time his case reached the Supreme Court, 16 people had been killed by police use of the chokehold, 12 of them black men. The Supreme Court dismissed the case, however, ruling that Lyons lacked standing to seek an injunction against the deadly practice. In order to have standing, the court reasoned, Lyons would have to show that he was highly likely to be subject to a chokehold again. Lyons argued that, as a black man, he had good reason to fear he would be stopped by the police for a minor traffic violation and subjected to a chokehold again. He had done nothing to provoke the chokehold. To the contrary, he had obeyed instructions and cooperated fully. Why wouldn't he believe he was at risk of being stopped and choked again? The court, however, ruled that in order to have standing, Lyons would have had not only to allege that he would have another encounter with the police, but also to make the incredible assertion, either 1, that all police officers in Los Angeles always choke any citizen with whom they have an encounter, whether for the purpose of arrest, issuing a citation, or for questioning, or 2, that the city ordered or authorized the police to act in such a manner. Lyons did not allege race discrimination, but if he had, that claim would almost certainly have been a loser too. The court's ruling in Lyons makes it extremely difficult to challenge systemic race discrimination in law enforcement and obtain meaningful policy reform. For example, African Americans in Seattle who hope to end the Seattle Police Department's discriminatory tactics through litigation would be required to prove that they plan to violate drug laws and that they will almost certainly face race discrimination by Seattle police officers engaged in drug law enforcement in order to have standing to seek reform, i.e., just to get in the courthouse door. It is worthy of note that the Lyons standard does not apply to suits for damages, but any suggestion that litigants need not worry about policy reform because they can always sue for damages would be disingenuous, particularly as applied to race discrimination cases. Why? Neither the state nor the state police can be sued for damages. In a series of cases, the Supreme Court has ruled that the state and its offices are immune from federal suits for damages under the 11th Amendment to the Constitution, unless they consent, and the state can't be sued for damages for constitutional violations in state court either. City police departments, like the LAPD, are also typically off-limits. The court has ruled that a city police department cannot be sued for damages unless a specific city policy or custom can be identified authorizing the illegal practice. Most cities, of course, do not have policies specifically authorizing illegal conduct, particularly race discrimination, and custom is notoriously difficult to prove. Accordingly, suing a city police department for damages is generally not an option. Yet even if all of those hurdles can somehow be overcome, there is still the matter of proving a claim of race discrimination. As we have seen, to establish an equal protection violation, one must prove intentional discrimination, conscious racial bias. Law enforcement officials rarely admit to having acted for racial reasons, leaving most victims of discriminatory law enforcement without anyone to sue and without a claim that can be proven in a court of law. But even if a plaintiff managed to overcome all of the procedural hurdles and prove that a police officer deliberately exercised his or her discretion on the basis of race, that still might not be enough. Race as a factor. The dirty little secret of policing is that the Supreme Court has actually granted the police license to discriminate. This fact is not advertised by police departments because law enforcement officials know that the public would not respond well to this fact in the era of colorblindness. It is the sort of thing that is better left unsaid. Civil rights lawyers, including those litigating racial profiling cases, have been complicit in this silence, fearing that any acknowledgement that race-based policing is authorized by law would legitimate in the public mind the very practice they are hoping to eradicate. The truth, however, is this. At other stages of the criminal justice process, the court has indicated that overt racial bias necessarily triggers strict scrutiny, a concession that has not been costly, as very few law enforcement officials today are foolish enough to admit bias openly. But the Supreme Court has indicated that in policing, race can be used as a factor in discretionary decision-making. In United States v. Brignoni-Ponce, the court concluded it was permissible under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment for the police to use race as a factor in making decisions about which motorists to stop and search. In that case, the court concluded that the police could take a person's Mexican appearance into account when developing reasonable suspicion that a vehicle may contain undocumented immigrants. The court said that the likelihood that any person of Mexican ancestry is an alien is high enough to make Mexican appearance a relevant factor. Some commentators have argued that Brignoni-Ponce may be limited to the immigration context. The court might not apply the same principle to drug law enforcement. It is not obvious what the rational basis would be for limiting overt race discrimination by police to immigration. The likelihood that a person of Mexican ancestry is an alien could not be significantly higher than the likelihood that any random black person is a drug criminal. The court's quiet blessing of race-based traffic stops has led to something of an Orwellian public discourse regarding racial profiling. Police departments and highway patrol agencies frequently declare, "We do not engage in racial profiling," even though their officers routinely use race as a factor when making decisions regarding whom to stop and search. The justification for the implicit doublespeak, "We do not racial profile, we just stop people based on race," can be explained in part by the Supreme Court's jurisprudence. Because the Supreme Court has authorized the police to use race as a factor when making decisions regarding whom to stop and search, police departments believe that racial profiling exists only when race is the sole factor. Thus, if race is one factor, but not the only factor, then it doesn't really count as a factor at all. The absurdity of this logic is evidenced by the fact that police almost never stop anyone solely because of race. A young black male wearing baggy pants, standing in front of his high school, surrounded by a group of similarly dressed black friends, may be stopped and searched because police believe he looks like a drug dealer. Clearly, race is not the only reason for that conclusion. Gender, age, attire, and location play a role. The police would likely ignore an 85-year-old black man standing in the same spot, surrounded by a group of elderly black women. The problem is that, although race is rarely the sole reason for a stop and search, it is frequently a determinative reason. A young white male wearing baggy pants, standing in front of his high school and surrounded by his friends, might well be ignored by police officers. It might never occur to them that a group of young white kids might be dealing dope in front of their high school. Similarly situated people inevitably are treated differently when police are granted permission to rely on racial stereotypes when making discretionary decisions. Equally important, though, the sole factor test ignores the ways in which seemingly race-neutral factors, such as location, operate in a highly discriminatory fashion. Some law enforcement officials claim that they would stop and search white kids wearing baggy jeans in the ghetto. That would be suspicious. It just so happens they're rarely there. Subjecting people to stops and searches because they live in high-crime ghettos cannot be said to be truly race-neutral, given that the ghetto itself was constructed to contain and control groups of people defined by race. Even seemingly race-neutral factors, such as prior criminal history, are not truly race-neutral. A black kid arrested twice for possession of marijuana may be no more of a repeat offender than a white frat boy who regularly smokes pot in his dorm room. But because of his race and his confinement to a racially segregated ghetto, the black kid has a criminal record, while the white frat boy, because of his race and relative privilege, does not. Thus, when prosecutors throw the book at black repeat offenders, or when police stalk ex-offenders and subject them to regular frisks and searches on the grounds that it makes sense to watch criminals closely, they are often exacerbating racial disparities created by the discretionary decision to wage the war on drugs almost exclusively in poor communities of color. Defending against claims of racial bias in policing is easy. Because race is never the only reason for a stop or search, any police officer with a fifth-grade education will be able to cite multiple non-racial reasons for initiating an encounter, including any number of the so-called indicators of drug trafficking discussed in Chapter 2, such as appearing too nervous or too calm. Police officers, like prosecutors, are highly adept at offering race-neutral reasons for actions that consistently disadvantage African Americans. Whereas prosecutors claim they strike black jurors not because of their race, but because of their hairstyle, police officers have their own stock excuses. For example, "Your Honor, we didn't stop him because he's black. We stopped him because he failed to use his turn signal at the right time." Or, "It wasn't just because he was black. It was also because he seemed nervous when he saw the police car." Judges are just as reluctant to second-guess an officer's motives as they are to second-guess prosecutors. So long as officers refrain from uttering racial epithets, and so long as they show the good sense not to say, "The only reason I stopped him was 'cause he was black," courts generally turned a blind eye to patterns of discrimination by the police. Studies of racial profiling have shown that police do in fact exercise their discretion regarding whom to stop and search in the drug war in a highly discriminatory manner. Not only do police discriminate in their determinations regarding where to wage the war, but they also discriminate in their judgments regarding whom to target outside of the ghetto's invisible walls. The most famous of these studies were conducted in New Jersey and Maryland in the 1990s. Allegations of racial profiling in federally funded drug interdiction operations resulted in numerous investigations and comprehensive data demonstrating a dramatic pattern of racial bias in highway patrol stops and searches. These drug interdiction programs were the brainchild of the DEA, part of the federally funded program known as Operation Pipeline. In New Jersey, the data showed that only 15% of all drivers on the New Jersey Turnpike were racial minorities, yet 42% of all stops and 73% of all arrests were of black motorists, despite the fact that blacks and whites violated traffic laws at almost exactly the same rate. While radar stops were relatively consistent with the percentage of minority violators, discretionary stops made by officers involved in drug interdiction resulted in double the number of stops of minorities. A subsequent study conducted by the Attorney General of New Jersey found that searches on the turnpike were even more discriminatory than the initial stops. 77% of all consent searches were of minorities. The Maryland studies produced similar results. African Americans comprised only 17% of drivers along a stretch of I-95 outside of Baltimore, yet they were 70% of those who were stopped and searched. Only 21% of all drivers along that stretch of highway were racial minorities, Latinos, Asians, and African Americans. Yet those groups comprised nearly 80% of those pulled over and searched. What most surprised many analysts was that, in both studies, whites were actually more likely than people of color to be carrying illegal drugs or contraband in their vehicles. In fact, in New Jersey, whites were almost twice as likely to be found with illegal drugs or contraband as African Americans, and 5 times as likely to be found with contraband as Latinos. Although whites were more likely to be guilty of carrying drugs, they were far less likely to be viewed as suspicious, resulting in relatively few stops, searches, and arrests of whites. The former New Jersey Attorney General dubbed this phenomenon the circular illogic of racial profiling. Law enforcement officials, he explained, often point to the racial composition of our prisons and jails as a justification for targeting racial minorities, but the empirical evidence actually suggested the opposite conclusion was warranted. The disproportionate imprisonment of people of color was, in part, a product of racial profiling, not a justification for it. In the years following the release of the New Jersey and Maryland data, dozens of other studies of racial profiling have been conducted. A brief sampling. In Volusia County, Florida, a reporter obtained 148 hours of video footage documenting more than 1,000 highway stops conducted by state troopers. Only 5% of the drivers on the road were African American or Latino, but more than 80% of the people stopped and searched were minorities. In Illinois, the state police initiated a drug interdiction program known as Operation Valkyrie that targeted Latino motorists. While Latinos comprised less than 8% of the Illinois population and took fewer than 3% of the personal vehicle trips in Illinois, they comprised approximately 30% of the motorists stopped by drug interdiction officers for discretionary offenses, such as failure to signal a lane change. Latinos, however, were significantly less likely than whites to have illegal contraband in their vehicles. A racial profiling study in Oakland, California in 2001 showed that African Americans were approximately twice as likely as whites to be stopped and 3 times as likely to be searched. Pedestrian stops, too, have been the subject of study and controversy. The New York Police Department released statistics in February 2007 showing that during the prior year, its officers stopped an astounding 508,540 people, an average of 1,393 per day, who were walking down the street, perhaps on their way to the subway, grocery store, or bus stop. Often the stops included searches for illegal drugs or guns, searches that frequently required people to lie face down on the pavement or stand spread-eagled against a wall while police officers aggressively groped all over their bodies while bystanders watched or walked by. The vast majority of those stopped and searched were racial minorities, and more than half were African American. The NYPD began collecting data on pedestrian stops following the shooting of Amadou Diallo, an African immigrant who died in a hail of police bullets on the front steps of his own home in February 1999. Diallo was followed to his apartment building by 4 white police officers, members of the elite street crime unit, who viewed him as suspicious and wanted to interrogate him. They ordered him to stop, but according to the officers, Diallo did not respond immediately. He walked a bit farther to his apartment building, opened the door, and retrieved his wallet, probably to produce identification. The officers said they thought the wallet was a gun, and fired 41 times. Amadou Diallo died at the age of 22. He was unarmed and had no criminal record. Diallo's murder sparked huge protests, resulting in a series of studies commissioned by the Attorney General of New York. The first study found that African Americans were stopped 6 times more frequently than whites, and that stops of African Americans were less likely to result in arrests than stops of whites, presumably because blacks were less likely to be found with drugs or other contraband. Although the NYPD attempted to justify the stops on the grounds that they were designed to get guns off the street, stops by the Street Crime Unit, the group of officers who supposedly are specially trained to identify gun-toting thugs, yielded a weapon in only 2.5% of all stops. Rather than reducing reliance on stop-and-frisk tactics following the Diallo shooting and the release of this disturbing data, the NYPD dramatically increased its number of pedestrian stops and continued to stop and frisk African Americans at grossly disproportionate rates. The NYPD stopped 5 times more people in 2005 than in 2002, the overwhelming majority of whom were African American or Latino. In Los Angeles, mass stops of young African American men and boys resulted in the creation of a database containing the names, addresses, and other biographical information of the overwhelming majority of young black men in the entire city. The LAPD justified its database as a tool for tracking gang or gang-related activity. However, the criterion for inclusion in the database is notoriously vague and discriminatory. Having a relative or friend in a gang and wearing baggy jeans is enough to put youth on what the ACLU calls a blacklist. In Denver, displaying any 2 of a list of attributes, including slang, clothing of a particular color, pagers, hairstyles, or jewelry, earns youth a spot in the Denver Police's gang database. In 1992, citizen activism led to an investigation which revealed that 8 out of every 10 people of color in the entire city were on the list of suspected criminals.
Katherine, Massey Book Club, Context of White Supremacy. Okay, we will pick up second audio segment, what do you call it? I don't think this is a chapter. We'll say subchapter, subsection, the end of an era. That's what we'll pick up at very beginning, the second audio segment, Katherine Massey Book Club. Before we get to everybody, we have another massive kind of, I don't even know what to say, kind of piecemeal revision here. So the chapter that or subsection that we just heard, just concluded, right a couple paragraphs before the end, there is a major rewrite. The paragraph, the first sentence is, rather than reducing reliance on stop and frisk tactics. From that paragraph, it ends with the sentence African American or Latino. The 2020 10th anniversary edition, that paragraph is substantially longer. It's quite a bit different, like way different. So I'm going to start. This is the 10th anniversary edition, all the edits and such. So it reads, rather than reducing reliance on stop and frisk tactics following the Diallo shooting and the release of this disturbing data, the NYPD dramatically increased its number of pedestrian stops and continued to stop and frisk African Americans at grossly disproportionate rates. The NYPD stopped 5 times more people in 2005 than in 2002, the overwhelming majority of whom were African American or Latino. Beginning of the changes. By 2008, the NYPD was stopping 545,000 people in a single year, and 80% of the people stopped were African Americans and Latinos. Whites comprised a mere 8% of people frisked by NYPD, while African Americans accounted for 85% of all frisks. A report by the New York Times found that the highest concentration of stops in the city was a roughly 8-block area of Brownsville, Brooklyn, that was predominantly black. Residents there were stopped at a rate 13 times the city average. Although the NYPD frequently attempts to justify stop and frisk operations in poor communities, so-called, of color, on the grounds that such tactics are necessary to get guns off the street, less than 1% of stops, 0.15%, result in guns being found, and guns and other contraband were seized less often in stops of African Americans and Latinos than of whites. Now, I do think that portion is in the piece that I read, I think, or in the piece that we heard. I think that's there. I'll go back to double check. That's why I said, like, whoo, I'm venomously upset about this here text because, man, so much change. Anyway, okay, so that portion, the little bit of tidbit of data, that is not in the updated. Continuing. As Darius Charney, a lawyer for the Center for Constitutional Rights, observed, these studies confirm what we have been saying for the last 10 or 11 years, which is that with stop and frisk patterns, it is really race, not crime, that is driving this. Ultimately, these stop and frisk operations amount to a much more than humiliating, demeaning rituals for young men of color who must raise their arms and spread their legs, always careful not to make a sudden move or gesture that could provide an excuse for brutal, even lethal force. Like the days when black men were expected to step off the sidewalk and cast their eyes downward when a white woman passed, young black men know the drill when they see the police crossing the street toward them. It is a ritual of dominance and submission played out hundreds of thousands of times each year. But it is more than that. These routine encounters serve as the gateway into the criminal justice system. The NYPD made 50,300 marijuana arrests in 2010 alone, mostly of young men of color. As one report noted, these marijuana arrests offer training opportunities for rookie police who can practice on ghetto kids while earning overtime. These arrests serve another purpose as well. They are the most effective way for the NYPD to collect fingerprints, photographs, and other information on young people not yet entered into the criminal database. A simple arrest for marijuana possession can show up on criminal databases as a drug arrest without specifying the substance or the charge, and without clarifying even whether the person was convicted. These databases are then used by police and prosecutors, as well as by employers and housing officials, an electronic record that will haunt many for life. More than 353,000 people were arrested and jailed by the NYPD between 1997 and 2006 for simple possession of small amounts of marijuana, with blacks 5 times more likely to be arrested than whites. And then it resumes with in Los Angeles, and we heard all that as we go out. Now, I'm just looking at some of that great, wonderful information. Again, I'm noting the focus is going back to cannabis, drugs, which again, her thesis, according to her testimony, she said violent crime was 32% in the 2010. Then she moved it to 52%. Violent crime, those are the people that are in greater confinement, are there because they've committed a violent crime. 52% of the prison population. That means the war on drugs is not the big, factor in getting all of these folks charges and behind bars. This chunk right here with all this added data would again tend to lead me in this direction. But the other thing I noted is the study she gets at the end here with the footnote. It's footnote 114 for this chapter. This data, 1997 to 2006, I'm going to give her a pass for everything if she wants to include like the first year of the Obama presidency, 2009, because for most books, it takes about a year for them to be published, sometimes more. I've interviewed many authors, and I've heard many different authors from around the world talk about this process and the editing and making changes and everything that has to happen to get that book to the shelf. It is not a quick process, especially if you go through like a big publisher. It can take a year or more, 18 months, like that sort of thing. It is not a quick process. So she could have easily handed over the manuscript at the beginning of 2009, and then they take the next 12 months to get it ready, and then bang, it's right there, January 2010. That could have happened. This data is available in 2006, 2007, 2008. Like, you could have got all this. Yeah, this study was available in 2008. Like, you could have had this, I think, unless you're telling me it came out at the very end of the year and you just didn't see it and you got those babies and white grandma couldn't hang in that day. Unless you're telling me that, like, at minimum, that is a lot of text to add. And I'm saying it's like every week there are big chunks of text that are added. Sometimes she's changing statistics. Sometimes she's adding fables and newer data, wants to get a jab in at Obama. Every week, it's been a major change that I've had to gotta change. And I think it's even more coming. And then, as I said, she told us at the very beginning, it's basically the same book. No, it is not. And I mean, even to say that when you got different statistics, it's like, man, woo, the red bone deception. The number 720-716-7300. The code 564943. Pound. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. Number again, 720-716-7300. The code 564943. Pound. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. Our email, untiljustice@gmail.com. If you have commentary, feel free to share. Even the archives, we have read a considerable chunk of this text at this point. I thought we had got like halfway through the book or so, but it looks like we still have quite a ways to go. So maybe not quite half. Well, yeah, maybe about halfway through the text at this point. About halfway or so. A little more than halfway at this point. Email number 1. The New Jim Crow, AI Accuracy, and Michelle Alexander. Hello, Gus, Cows listeners. I've been following along with Michelle Alexander's book discussion. I originally read the book several years ago, didn't we all? And while I was not completely impressed with it, listening again now has made me even more critical, perhaps because I am less confused today. After reading the book years ago, I later found out that Michelle Alexander has a white parent, C.O.W.S. I'm emailing because I laughed recently asking Gemini AI for some background details on Mrs. Alexander, and it responded that both of her parents are black. Lol. See below. It is fascinating how returning to a book years later, especially in a group setting, Katherine Massey Book Club, can completely shift your perspective. Reading with a critical eye is exactly what book clubs are for. Woo! And it sounds like this second pass is hitting a lot differently for you. Hopefully so. However, before diving into a critique of her framing and how she handles complex topics, there's a quick factual detail to clear up. Michelle Alexander actually does not have a white parent. Both of her parents, John and Sandra Alexander, were black. You do get some AI slop, so you do need to verify things. I guess we cannot rely absolutely on the accuracy of AI. Absolutely not yet. Even as it pertains to the system of white supremacy. I did correct Gemini. Good job. I firmly believe that having a white parent, spouse, or so-called close friend does definitely skew one's opinion of the system of white supremacy. How could it not? Let's see. We have other emails. I'll get hands and emails, all that good stuff. Let's see. Give me 1 second. I'm trying to getting it together. Okay. I'll get listener, then I'll get more emails. We'll do it that way. *61 if you have commentary. Our caller at 5962. 5962. Did you have commentary to share?
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah, I only have a couple things from this reading. I agree with the emailer reading this again the second time with a more critical eye and less confusion of what racism, white supremacy definitely has you thinking about the book in a different term. And then when she was talking about, right at the beginning of our text, when she was talking about the Batson standard, it just made me think about the recent, 2022, I believe, Emmett Till passing law for hate crimes, and how both of those are just so vaguely written that they can basically be used against Black people in terms of those legal documentations. And then the other thing that I had was when she's talking about Burgioni versus the U.S., I just thought that there were other examples closer to her to when her book was released that she could have went through with the Wren versus the United States of the perpetual stop green light, where two Black men are driving in a high drug area in Washington, D.C. and stopped by plainclothes officers. I think she could have added that, as well as the United States versus Armstrong in '96. Just a couple of cases that are closer to when she released the book that she could have had. And then again, her usage of colorblindness, when she's talking about race as a factor, and that there's this dirty secret of policing that the Supreme Court has actually granted the police. I don't think it's a dirty secret, one. And two, in that text, it seems like she shifts the blame from, again, her use of law enforcement officials, aka white people, onto civil rights lawyers because they're complicit in their silence. And that's all I have.
Oh, she much obliged, sir. I believe dirty is in Mr. Neely Fuller Jr.'s word guide. Dirty little secret. He might even have that as one of the permutations and uses of that word, but that's one of those caution, dirty books and that sort of thing. Like, hey, watch that, because they often say Black people are dirt and mud people and that sort of thing. So you always caution, dirty little secret. And I would agree. That is not no dirty little secret. In fact, James Lowen, 2 times suspected racist. We did read Sundown Towns, and it is in that book. It ain't no secret. The word he used was, it is an expectation that this is how enforcement officers will behave. Behave meaning you will get your nigger knocker and crack these Negro skulls and make sure that they are out of here at sundown town or whatever else that we do. But this is what this is what we expect you to do. And she even, in fact, she told us, or I don't know, retract. She discussed Tulia, Texas, and all the black people that were rounded up. I think one of our listeners said that the one non-black person that they arrested was a white woman who had a so-called black boyfriend, Cowbell. I might have that. My memory might be bad. But anyway, in Tulia, it was like 99% black people that they arrested, falsely making up charges and fabricating evidence and all the rest of it, the white enforcement officials. But they said when this was on TV and the white residents of Tulia and I guess the surrounding Texas area saw this, it wasn't I'm going to dig in, get some more information. I know some of these colored boys and gals, and, I think, that can't be, or even just, wow, they arrested all these people for drug? Like, this is kind of a small town. Like, how many what? It wasn't none of that. It was, good job. That's right. I know Leroy was crooked and dirty. Like to see get these criminals off the street. Good job. Good job. That's what it wasn't no outrage, and we don't understand. And I can't shock, and I can't believe. In fact, they said the one white man, I played the segment, the one white man who did look at this and say, man, that don't seem right at all. They said he sat around and told nigger jokes and said nigger all the time. Can't even say he wasn't racist. That's Tulia. That's earlier in the book, but dirty. And I did catch that, sir. She did. One more time. It's not white people are to blame. It's not racists are to blame. It's not her racist grandfathers to blame. No. Those no-count civil rights lawyers. They are to blame. Don't let me get started on the Congressional Black Caucus and such. They are to blame. What? Continuing. Much obliged, sir. Email number 2. The clip of greetings, Gus listeners, callers. The clip of Carter Stewart. This is from last week. Michelle Alexander's black husband, a Stanford alum as well. Beginning last week's book club was initially confusing to me. His comments about his black children's response to the movie Race about Jesse Owens. Ew. That's what they said was confusing to me initially because my brain computer interpreted what he was saying, identified him as white, even though I knew he was black. His seemingly lack of constructive response to his black children's comments may explain how we wind up with a text like the new Jim Crow. Hey, when I heard all of that, I way less confused about, okay, I got it. Continuing. The occupation, policing the enemy. Courts' blind eye to race discrimination in the criminal justice system has been especially problematic in policing. Racially biased police discretion. Everybody is blind, colorblind, blind eye, blind. Remember that old Third Eye Blind? Remember them? They got an oldie but goodies album, I bet you. But see, and remember, talking about oldie but goodies, the blind eye, our favorite old Mike Swango, he's still with us in the land of the living. And I said then, I don't think this is a blind eye. I don't think that was Swango. And Gary Webb popped up in that book too. Great journalist, still suspected racist. But I said with Mike Swango, I don't think the officials at Ohio State, New York, any of the other places where he practiced or not practice, but pretended to practice medicine and lied and killed people and all the rest of it. I don't think they were blind. A lot of these people were racist at minimum and into cronyism, and some of them literally racist and cronyism, because some of them said, we got too many non-white doctors. I want some white people who can speak English and look white like me. This is exactly what we read in the book. Not making this up. No hyperbole. That's what they said. That's what they wrote. So it wasn't that they were blind. They were racist. Even the white doctors and officials at Ohio State, they knew what was happening. Again, this was not an ocular problem. Nobody there had a cane and one of those canines that assists people that are disabled. And that wasn't the case. They made a massive report, looked at all the details and suspicious deaths and did an investigation and all that, and then refused to go to the police. That's not a blind eye. And same thing we said then. If this had been double O Welsing, ain't no way in the Christ it would have been no blind eye. Or, God, if it had been Leroy tiptoeing around the facility and got my syringe and people dying. So man, come on. Me and Bill Cosby would have been locked up. 2. Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton's book American Apartheid documents how racially segregated ghettos were deliberately created by federal policy, not impersonal market forces or private housing choices. This does not seem like white people are so colorblind, unconscious, or automatic, refuting the entire premise of her text. In my opinion, it should not be multiple points in the book where you point to things and say, ooh, this seems to refute the entire thesis of this book. We have had that repeatedly, and we're only halfway through. What he said, in my opinion, accurate if you're saying that these areas where they got the war on drugs deliberately targeted were deliberately created to warehouse dark people, and then we're going to further go lump them up and re-enslave them and all the rest, put them in greater confinement. What is colorblind about this? Come on. And even kudos for old the C.O.W.S and Gus T, Douglas Massey. We know him personally. He was a guest on the C.O.W.S springtime 2023, if my memory is correct, and he told us in flagrant detail. He talked about the 2008 financial collapse, and he talked about white racist financiers at the banks, lending institutions, and he wrote in writing in his report, I read it verbatim on the program, he said, those racist bankers said, ooh, Leroy, Lakeisha and them, they're ignorant, they're stupid, they got zero fiscal literacy. We gonna take every piece of lint out of their pocket. And I brought it up with Mr. Massey. I said, dang, they didn't say nothing about, hey, Leroy, Lakeisha and them, they smart. They've been studying racism, white supremacy, and economics, and old Amos Wilson, and boy, we better at least get some black tellers and some black, loan officers and things, so they come in here because they're going to ask some questions and they're going to read all the fine print and they're going to be looking like you ain't going to swindle me. I know you old racist bank. Like we got to be careful now. They kind of suspicious, they're a little paranoid. So it's going to take some time. We might have to bring them in 2 or 3 times. They didn't say none of that. They're ignorant. They're stupid. We're going to take every piece of lint out of their pocket. And they did. Call it subprime loan crisis and all that. Again, in the C.O.W.S archives, 2023, if memory is bad. Even if the year is wrong, Douglas Massey was with us. So it would just be, it was 2024. But I think it was 23. Craig Futterman, a law professor at the University of Chicago. Students frequently express shock and dismay when they venture into the communities, that word again, for the first time and witness. Is anybody else suspicious of this anecdote? Could it be an exaggeration or maybe even a lie that frequently the students were unaware were shocked by what they saw. Maybe it was only one or two, but the vast majority saw nothing wrong. Maybe, well, he did say law professor. He did say law professor, because I was going to say maybe they're freshmen. Maybe they're 18 or something like that, so they haven't really been out in the world. They've just been watching TV at their parents' house, so they go out and see all, they're like, whoa, what? They're just, what? Maybe, I was thinking about it, he's a law professor, so if these folks are like 22, 23, 24, white 22, 23, 24, you're like, you are worldly. You probably got a passport by then, and even the poor white people like, you are white. You for sure know the deal by 22, 23, 25, especially if you're in law school. You went through 4 years of college and you're what? Come on. If anything, what I was thinking was maybe it shocked them, the differential in terms of what I normally say, like, hey, what brother Gus T say all the time, officer, ma'am, sir, I know you're just doing your job. I do not consent to searches of my person, property, residence, or vehicle without a warrant. Maybe that's what they're accustomed to, maybe not even having to say it, because the officers don't do all that by default. They get over here, put your hands on the car and go through your pockets, touch your genitals and all that. They don't do all that, so they've never seen that before. And some of them, I think they said, I know what the law is supposed to be, what I just said. You're not supposed to be able to do all that unless you got a warrant. Like, what is going on? Like, what? Maybe. But again, I'm thinking you should know the deal. Unless these are just really naive, very young, little training race soldiers. And so they're just accustomed to how the police behave where they live with other white people. And so now going in to see what they do in places like Cabrini Greens and the South Side, how they treat Obama and such. Whoa. Maybe, but I mean, maybe. 4, they also call into question the legitimacy of convenience as an excuse for the mass imprisonment of black and brown men in ghetto communities. Conventional wisdom that get tough tactics are a regrettable necessity in poor communities of color, and that efficiency requires the drug war be waged. I'm sure racist white supremacists are all upset about the necessity of their get tough tactics. Unconventional wisdom. University of Washington, the study's authors concluded based on their review and analysis of the empirical evidence that the SPD norms decisions to focus heavily on crack to the near exclusion of other drugs and to concentrate its efforts on the outdoor drug markets in downtown areas rather than drug markets located indoors or in predominantly white communities. The cows guest Norm Stamper, author of Breaking Rank, who was chief of Seattle Police from 1994 to 1999, absolutely, and he was a guest repeatedly. He came back in 2016. He wrote a different book, I already mentioned it, about policing, and he wrote a whole section specifically about all those warrantless searches and how easy it is for enforcement officers to lie, fabricate evidence, whatever they want. I don't have a warrant. I'm just poking around. You don't have anything to hide, do you, Leroy? I'm just poking around. Let's see. Oh, and he said, no, you should never. He's a former chief of police. You should never consent to those searches. Also, we had a black female who's a prosecuting attorney right here in King County. I just forgot her name because she was a guest on the program more than a decade ago. We've been here for 17 years, but prosecuting attorney, black female, she said about, unless my memory is bad, and I don't think it, I'm going to see if maybe we use this for the intro next week. She said about 40% of their cases are black males in King County, Washington. It's not even 10% of the population are black people. And that's all the black people. the black males, the black females, everybody. No, not even 10%. How is it 40%? Now again, maybe his memory is bad. He doesn't even remember her name, so maybe, but I don't think, it was not no 4%. It was not 20%. It was 40%. Like, woo. And I had to go back to it. I don't know if she said that. That's all cannabis and reefer madness up here in the 206, but woo, they lock up some black dudes here in the 206. Jesus. And even when she said that, when she mentioned Seattle, she said in the racially mixed city of Seattle, I almost gagged. One, Washington is one of the whitest states in the Union. This lion heifer, Michelle Alexander, knows that 'cause she grew up in Oregon, also one of the whitest states in the Union, the Pacific Northwest, which encompasses both Washington State and Oregon. In total, one of the whitest regions in North America. It is not racially mixed. And then when you look at the data, I think it's about 70% white, the time that they were talking about 70% white, 30% non-white. Black people, again, representing less than 10% of the population. I said if that counts as so-called racially mixed, pretty much everywhere would be racially mixed except where Michelle Alexander grew up in Ashland, Oregon. Facts. Hollow hope, after all, obtaining reform through city council. Reform through city council or state legislature may seem unlikely, for black criminals are perhaps the most despised minority in the U.S. population. More accurately stated, all black males are the most despised group in the U.S. Some caping for black males, for sure. By definition, black males are criminals, even if their only crime is their skin color. I was thinking that pretty much black is already criminal. I mean, you right, because they say, we got all these black market, see, and you got dirty hands, see, you got all, so you pretty much already a felon and black, about the same thing. Black, felon, criminal, it's about the same thing. It's about the same thing. Race as a factor. The dirty little secret of policing is that the Supreme Court has actually granted the police license to discriminate. Is it truly a secret? Question mark. 2. 1990s, New Jersey, the data showed that only 15% of all drivers on the New Jersey Turnpike were racial minorities, yet 42% of all stops and 73% of all arrests were black motorists, despite the fact that blacks and whites violated traffic laws at almost exactly the same rate. Whites were actually more likely than people of color to be carrying illegal drugs. I recall a particularly egregious case on the New Jersey Turnpike regarding this. In 1998, 4 males, 3 black, 1 Hispanic, were traveling on the turnpike in a van heading to North Carolina for a basketball tryout when they were stopped and the troopers shot into the van. No one was killed, fortunately, but the case was publicized nationally. Reverend Al became involved and President Clinton commented on it. The troopers were indicted and pled guilty, but received no jail time or probation. Go figure. CUPI, New Jersey State Troopers plead guilty. 3. New York Police Department released statistics in February 2007. Amadou Diallo, an African-American immigrant who died in a hail of police bullets on the front steps of his died in a hail of police bullets on the front steps of his own home in February '99, The 4 NYPD officers were indicted for second-degree murder. Mr. Diallo was unarmed. The trial venue was changed to Albany, New York. There were 4 black jurors, 8 white. Rudy Giuliani was mayor of NY at the time. The officers were acquitted, of course. The family later settled a lawsuit for $3 million. That seems very low, given. His parents were living in Ghanea, where he was originally from at the time of his murder. Pretend black person? The last words he ever spoke to his mother, "Mom, I'm going to college." Not so fast. Black male privilege. Lots on that case. I think, didn't he say he had a wallet? He had like a wallet that he was trying to pull out, and they thought the wallet might be an AR-15 or something of that case, and they had to shoot him, 15,000 times and all that, if I remember correctly. That's been long. A lot of black male privilege over the years. Let's see. *61 if other folks have commentary to share, and then I'll get in a few of my comments before we get to the second chunk of text. Oh, well, pause. Victim in New Jersey with us as well. Did you have commentary to share? So, oh, he's right there. You've been smacked around the head to get the Negro knocker out and crack your head on the Jersey Turnpike because you've been smuggling reefer or crack or methamphetamines or knockoff Jordans, all of the above, maybe.
Yeah, that was a real interesting time, Gus, because the makeup of the New Jersey police is they run it like a military structure. You know what I mean? That's how their training is. White crew cut. So them guys was really, they was real serious, no nonsense. In those times. Even in Camden, New Jersey, when it was touted to be one of the violentest cities, United States during that time. It was a real big thing that state troopers was deployed. And then, they also was deployed at Irvington, which borders Newark, New Jersey. So, yeah, the state police in New Jersey, had reputation for, roughing black males up. Last week, she went into prosecutors and their discretion. I thought I was going to get a lot out because I think that a lot of people don't know, how the process works, as it relates to indictments, the grand jury, and also prosecutors can charge, overcharge to get black people or get people in general to a lesser plea. This is, so they overcharge, and eventually knowing that them charges are not going to, those aren't the charges they're trying to get you on, but they overcharge you is like a scare tactic, and then they get you to come around and take lesser charge. That's how a lot of plea deals. Now, this would have been a great time to give examples for husband. We are talking about prosecutors and their discretion. He also said how much power they hold. So we could have got clear examples on how or if her husband is a progressive prosecutor. We're in an age where everybody's talking about they don't want these woke prosecutors who just letting everybody free. So I think that would have been a great addition to give examples of a just prosecutor who doesn't abuse he or she's power. She could have gave examples of her husband. Maybe that might have been too personal, but if you are to enlighten the public about the new Jim Crow and how the system works, I mean, you're sleeping with a prosecutor every night. I think she missed the opportunity to do that. I could be incorrect, and that might be none of our business. That was just what I thought.
She did mention Mr. Carter in the 10th anniversary edition, and importantly, she included that he doesn't agree with the book. Now, a few of us have said he, Stanford alum, Mr. Stewart is, he might have looked at all this and come to the same conclusion that we did. You lying and cheating with the stats and everything else. I don't take this serious neither. Whatever. Maybe. But she mentioned him. She said he doesn't agree. If you're talking about all the prosecutorial discretion and power that they wield, man. What my Julia Roberts favorite, what they call it, sleeping with the prosecutor. She could have gave us a teaspoon, case or two. And I played this segment last week with Carter Stewart. So, he goes out and talks. I don't know if he'd say he's a woke prosecutor or anything like that. But, he goes out and talks about, hey, we need to be more, progressive and reform, how we handle these cases. And let's get some of these people out of confinement and deal with race and blah, blah, blah and all that. So, yeah. Y'all don't talk about this? You don't have the one. That's at least 2 points. If you're going to mention your parents in the book, because being truthful, I thought the exact same thing, but not about her husband. I thought this about her dad. When she went through all that about black dudes getting pulled over and they put you in the chokehold, and if you, drop your keys or fidget or whatever, and they put you in the chokehold or whatever, man, what did you see with your dad and his white wife where you all got kicked out of the white family and you got kicked out the church and and then y'all go to live in a racially restricted region? What did you see your black and she talks, that's what I'm saying. She talks about this in interviews and such. They have interviews where she says, oh man, I done been in the car and they done pulled my dad over and oh Lord, I thought he was about to get killed and we was going to watch it. Oh Lord, and what we going to do? And then we are in the car with mom. Nothing like that ever happens. Duh. That's what you were thinking, the sentiment that, man, she should have included something personal in it. And again, because all of these people are mentioned, that would have been, as opposed to all of her goofy statistics that she has to come and change and make up and fabricate and all the rest of it. Give us something authentic, man. That's right in line with the subject matter, and which would also impugn all this, color blindness and blindness and it's a vision. No, that's not what it is at all. Much obliged. Victim in New Jersey on the Turnpike. Let's see. I guess with some of the new NYC experience about all this too. Let me go back and see if I can get a few of my notes really quick, and then we'll push off to the next audio segment. Okay, got it here. We have heard Mr. Valkyrie before. That's they said in Illinois they had the police program to target so-called Latinos. Way back when we read Leonida McLean, A Foot in Each World, he was talked about as one of the white politicians at the time. I believe he had a whole gang of white suspected racist politicians who were against Mayor Harold Washington at the time, but my memory might be a little off. It's been a decade since we read that one. Going all the way back to the beginning. Let's see. Well, the beginning for this week at least. Let's see. Wow, we got further, but okay. I too, blind. Come on, that's not the problem here. When she says all this, when she talks about the SWAT teams and we're going to have our drug busts in the suburbs or at the white fraternities, all of this could have happened? No, it could not. It would have never got started. I mean, that is a fundamental misunderstanding of white supremacy, racism, and what this is all about. And you know this because even when white people become aware that these other white people are selling drugs and doing illegal activity, they are still not treated like black people. So again, it's not a vision problem. No, not at all. That's not what the system of white supremacy racism is about. Like, not even close. Let's see. I thought it was so trash. She says, as one former prosecutor put it, it's a lot easier to go out to the hood, so to speak, and pick somebody than to put your resources in an undercover operation in a community, that word, where there are potentially politically powerful people. The P alliteration. Couldn't just say white people. If you're classified as white, does that automatically mean you are a potentially powerful political person? Yes. Let's see. She says what happens to them, meaning black people, victims of the so-called war on drugs and racism, does not directly affect and is scarcely, that missed the S part, scarcely noticed by the privileged beyond the ghetto's invisible walls. All of that, metaphors on top of metaphors. What invisible walls? And I even had a pause. We read Minister Malcolm X, amongst many others. Even St. James Lowen 2-3 times. He said white people, as a matter of pattern, standard operating procedure, they would pile the vice, prostitution, gambling, drugs, whatever. They would pile that up in Nigger Town, where the black people live, and then they go over there whenever they feel like it. If I want some nigger gals, prostitution, Dorothy Roberts' white dad peeping, we go do that. We want some drug. Minister Malcolm X, Detroit Red got a whole section where he talked about that was what I did for a living for a time. White men want black girls. White men want black boys. White men want drugs. They want to come and peep on black people. Hop in. I got you. Detroit Red, I got you. Didn't we read that? Isn't that an autobiography? I'm lying. I'm making that up. Come on. Invisible wall. And white, I just told you, it's not that white people are ignorant. One, you got too many Dorothy Roberts white fathers peeping. They know what's happening and doing. The white police and everybody. Who do you think put the niggers here? Who do you think polices the niggers here? Who do you think goes to partake of Negro pride? Matter of fact, Houston, we read that one. They had an ordinance. They said, man, we got to do something about the niggers because they ruining white men. Got all of them running out here to these Negro brothels. Talked about that last year, man. Back up. Let's see. Even when they said the demand for illegal drugs in the Negro hoods and such, it's like, man, a whole lot of times it's white people running over there. They got movies about that and such, don't they? Traffic and bunches. And again, that's in Detroit Red Book, amongst others. That's in sundown towns too. Let's see. Seattle police, from the 2026 perspective, with the massive amounts of drug use, opioids, and all the rest of it that they have here, fentanyl and all of that in the Seattle area. Oh my God, and they are so permissive. And we have had at this point, so this book, the first time around, was published in 2010. By 2012, they had legal recreational cannabis here. So at this point, we've had 14 years of legal recreational cannabis. Now, for a period, it was still a problem that even after it was legal, you're not supposed to smoke it out in public. It's like an open can of beer or something. The police were still going to mostly target black people for smoking in public. Now, people say, well, the niggers, they got to smoke in public and blah, 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 and all the rest of it. So they even made a law to say that that is supposed to be the lowest priority of SPD. Anything related to cannabis consumption in public, something like that. Not selling, but if you're just puffing, something like that, get out of here. You got other things to do. Go get a donut. Leave Leroy alone. Put that, I think, unless I've been misinformed, but all of the drug permissiveness, like, oh my God, like they have, you can just go look, Seattle Times, and they have reports. It's been going on for years. Matter of fact, I think PBS, maybe within the last 10 years, not even maybe, scratch, within the last 10 years, they have a documentary about all of the opioid abuse and how hard it hit this the Pacific Northwest, Portland, Oregon area too, down in Ashland where she went to high school, ravaged all of these areas. And I think some of it is because it's white people. They are super permissive about drug use. I think even in Portland, for a time, they tried decriminalizing all drug use. We don't charge you. We don't arrest you. You can be snorting heroin and fentanyl, all of it out in public, and have a good day right on, Trailblazers. They keep on rolling. I think they repealed that because they said, wow, this has gotten really out of hand. Duh. But man, they are so permissive. It had got out of hand in a lot of places around here because they just, white people do what you want. You don't smoke fentanyl on the street all day? Do what you want, especially during COVID. Like, woo, really bad. Let's see. She says few politicians will leap at the opportunity to support black people labeled criminals. I think few politicians will leap at the opportunity to support black people. You could leave it right there. But white people weren't that enthused about Obama. He was not a criminal, and he has a white parent. Called him a monkey. The choking out the black male, Mr. Lyons, Lyons, by the LAPD, reminded me of Mark Furman. Also reminded me, Richard Pryor has a joke from like 50 years ago, before many of us were born, myself included. He has a joke about the LAPD, talking about that exact police department and saying, dang, is that the law? LAPD, can they choke a black person? They can just snap a black person's neck? And they said, oh yeah, that's a law right here. Section 3, page 12. Yep. Snatch neck. Yep. They get out of line. Pow. And he goes on to next joke, but reminded me of that one. And Mark Furman, as I said, and them, they've been talking about that chokehold for like a good 30, 40 years. And that one too, Norm Stamper. Now back to the original book where he talks about where he wrote, the bigger you are, the blacker you are, you gonna get your skull cracked. Not nothing to snort up your nose. I mean crack upside your skull. Norm Stamper said, boy, I grab old Adolph Lyons, I grab him, get my elbow and arm bicep underneath, get it around his esophagus, and I clamp on him, get around there, I clamp on him like a vice, and I whisper in his ear. That's what he said. He wrote, he said, I whisper in his ear, you're about to die, asshole. That's when they pass out and defecate on themselves. Like, man, what does it mean to be classified as white? We talked about that too. That's in the book. You can go all the way back, 2009, to Norm Stamper's first visit on the program. We talked about that in detail. He said and he said you do that. You go and you get that highly melanated black male and you choke him out and he urinates on himself, he defecated on himself, and he said, you go back to the precinct. It said it's like we won the Super Bowl, man. They high five, good job, yeah, and you see me, I choked that Boy, he was tapping down. He said, let me go. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I said, I choked. He said, we brag about it, man. Which is exactly what I heard about Abner Louima. That's not Amadou Diallo. Abner Louima, that's when Justin Volk, when he took the plunger and stuffed it up his nether regions, he did the same thing. Grabbed the plunger and run through the police department. Ha, 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 ha. You see what I did? Ha, ha, ha. Held it up like a trophy. The plunger I'm talking about. That's colorblind. That's another one. You put a plunger up someone's rectum, a black male, privileged, that's colorblind. Let's see. And even when Mr. Lyons brought his suit, the second part, they said that the city of L.A. ordered or authorized the police to act in such a manner. I said, that's what Richard Pryor said. It's in the rule book. Oh, yeah. You can snap Negro in half. You can break Negro's neck. Oh, yeah. Mark Furman said, you get mouthy with me if you want to. Mark Furman told him, he put it on the recording, you get mouthy with me when you want to. I will crack your skull and what? Mark Furman, we miss you, our sick white brother. Let's see. Anything else? Well, she said police officers, like prosecutors, are highly adept at offering race-neutral reasons for actions that consistently disadvantage African Americans, are highly adept at offering lies. Would that be one? I said that's even back to back, because then she comes back and she says police officers have their own stock lies. She says excuses, and that's one, because, I mean, they got books and reports and documentaries, everything you can imagine, comic books, I suspect it. Police are legally allowed to lie to citizens. Last thing I'll get in, it seems like so much of this, I keep just echoing in my mind, do not consent to searches without a warrant. They said 77% of all consent searches were of minorities. We should be working to bring that number down. And like I said, you're not woofing like you got an army behind you or a gang of 10,000 people and they're all armed and everything. Not at all. You are by yourself. But I do not consent to a search of my vehicle, person, property, residence without a warrant. That is massive. And Norm Stamper said that. We talked about that in detail in 2016. I cannot stress that enough. I mean, hey, all that snooping and peeping, that's another one. We're going to take advantage. We know we got the victims, non-white people. They'll be intimidated. They'll be too scared, or they won't know that they have a right to decline these searches. So we're going to get them. We're going to get them. You don't have anything. You don't mind if I poke around. I do not consent to searches without a warrant. That right there would be super helpful in stopping a whole lot of these cases. We will get to audio segment number 2. If you have additional thoughts, comments, write them down. We should have time to share. Katherine Massey Book Club, Michelle Alexander's new Jim Crow, Context of White Supremacy, audio segment 2.
The End of an Era. The litigation that swept the nation in the 1990s, challenging racial profiling practices, has nearly vanished. The news stories about people being stopped and searched on their way to church or work or school have faded from the evening news. This is not because the problem has been solved or because the experience of being stopped, interrogated, and searched on the basis of race has become less humiliating, alienating, or demoralizing as time has gone by. The lawsuits have disappeared because in a little-noticed case called Alexander v. Sandoval, decided in 2001, the Supreme Court eliminated the last remaining avenue available for challenging racial bias in the criminal justice system. Sandoval was not, on its face, even about criminal justice. It was a case challenging the Alabama Department of Public Safety's decision to administer state driver's license examinations only in English. the plaintiffs argued that the department's policy violated Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its implementing regulations, because the policy had the effect of subjecting non-English speakers to discrimination based on their national origin. The Supreme Court did not reach the merits of the case, ruling instead that the plaintiffs lacked the legal right even to file the lawsuit. It concluded that Title VI does not provide a private right of action to ordinary citizens and civil rights groups, meaning that victims of discrimination can no longer sue under the law. The Sandoval decision virtually wiped out racial profiling litigation nationwide. Nearly all of the cases alleging racial profiling in drug law enforcement were brought pursuant to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its implementing regulations. Title VI prohibits federally funded programs or activities from discriminating on the basis of race, and the regulations employ a disparate impact test for discrimination, meaning that plaintiffs could prevail in claims of race discrimination without proving discriminatory intent. Under the regulations, a federally funded law enforcement program or activity is unlawful if it has a racially discriminatory impact, and if that impact cannot be justified by law enforcement necessity. Because nearly all law enforcement agencies receive federal funding in the drug war, and because drug war tactics, such as pretext stops and consent searches, have a grossly discriminatory impact and are largely ineffective, plaintiffs were able to argue persuasively that the tactics could not be justified by law enforcement necessity. In 1999, for example, the ACLU of Northern California filed a class action lawsuit against the California Highway Patrol, CHP, alleging that its highway drug interdiction program violated Title VI of the Civil Rights Act because it relied heavily on discretionary pretext stops and consent searches that are employed overwhelmingly against African American and Latino motorists. During the course of the litigation, the CHP produced data that showed African Americans were twice as likely and Latinos 3 times as likely to be stopped and searched by its officers as were whites. The data further showed that consent searches were ineffective. Only a tiny percentage of the discriminatory searches resulted in the discovery of drugs or other contraband, yet thousands of black and brown motorists were subjected to baseless interrogations, searches, and seizures as a result of having committed a minor traffic violation. The CHP entered into a consent decree that provided for a 3-year moratorium on consent searches and pretext stops statewide, and the collection of comprehensive data on the race and ethnicity of motorists stopped and searched by the police, so that it would be possible to determine whether discriminatory practices were continuing. Similar results were obtained in New Jersey as a result of landmark litigation filed against the New Jersey State Police. After Sandoval, these cases can no longer be brought under Title VI by private litigants. Only the federal government can sue to enforce Title VI's anti-discrimination provisions, something it has neither the inclination nor the capacity to do in most racial profiling cases, due to its limited resources and institutional reluctance to antagonize local law enforcement. Since the war on drugs, private litigants represented by organizations such as the ACLU have been at the forefront of racial profiling litigation. Those days, however, have come to an end. The racial profiling cases that swept the nation in the 1990s may well be the last wave of litigation challenging racial bias in the criminal justice system that we see for a very long time. The Supreme Court has now closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias at every stage of the criminal justice process, from stops and searches to plea bargaining and sentencing. The system of mass incarceration is now, for all practical purposes, thoroughly immunized from claims of racial bias. Staggering racial disparities in the drug war continue, but rarely make the news. But that disparity is just the tip of the iceberg. As noted in Chapter 2, this system depends primarily on the prison label, not prison time. What matters most is who gets swept into this system of control and then ushered into an undercast. The legal rules adopted by the Supreme Court guarantee that those who find themselves locked up and permanently locked out due to the drug war are overwhelmingly black and brown. Chapter 4. The Cruel Hand. From Frederick Douglass, in a statement on behalf of delegates to the National Colored Convention held in Rochester, New York, in July 1853. A heavy and cruel hand has been laid upon us. As a people, we feel ourselves to be not only deeply injured, but grossly misunderstood. Our white countrymen do not know us. They are strangers to our character, ignorant of our capacity, oblivious to our history and progress, and are misinformed as to the principles and ideas that control and guide us as a people. The great mass of American citizens estimates us as being a characterless and purposeless people, and hence we hold up our heads, if at all, against the withering influence of a nation's scorn and contempt. When Frederick Douglass and the other delegates to the National Colored Convention converged in Rochester, New York, in the summer of 1853, to discuss the condition, status, and future of coloreds, as they were called then, they decried the stigma of race, the condemnation and scorn heaped upon them for no reason other than the color of their skin. Most of the delegates were freed slaves, though the younger ones may have been born free. Northern emancipation was complete, but freedom remained elusive. Blacks were finally free from the formal control of their owners, but they were not full citizens. They could not vote, they were subject to legal discrimination, and at any moment Southern plantation owners could capture them on the street and whisk them back to slavery. Although Northern slavery had been abolished, every black person was still presumed a slave, by law, and could not testify or introduce evidence in court. Thus, if a Southern plantation owner said you were a slave, you were, unless a white person interceded in a court of law on your behalf and testified that you were rightfully free. Slavery may have died, but for thousands of blacks, the badge of slavery lived on. Today, a criminal freed from prison has scarcely more rights, and arguably less respect, than a freed slave or a black person living free in Mississippi at the height of Jim Crow. Those released from prison on parole can be stopped and searched by the police for any reason or no reason at all, and returned to prison for the most minor of infractions, such as failing to attend a meeting with a parole officer. Even when released from the system's formal control, the stigma of criminality lingers. Police supervision, monitoring, and harassment are facts of life not only for all those labeled criminals, but for all those who look like criminals. Lynch mobs may be long gone, but the threat of police violence is ever present. A wrong move or sudden gesture could mean massive retaliation by the police. A wallet could be mistaken for a gun. The whites-only signs may be gone, but new signs have gone up. Notices placed in job applications, rental agreements, loan applications, forms for welfare benefits, school applications, and petitions for licenses, informing the general public that felons are not wanted here. A criminal record today authorizes precisely the forms of discrimination we supposedly left behind. Discrimination in employment, housing, education, public benefits, and jury service. Those labeled criminals can even be denied the right to vote. Criminals, it turns out, are the one social group in America we have permission to hate. In colorblind America, criminals are the new whipping boys. They are entitled to no respect and little moral concern. Like the coloreds, in the years following emancipation, criminals today are deemed a characterless and purposeless people, deserving of our collective scorn and contempt. When we say someone was treated like a criminal, what we mean to say is that he or she was treated as less than human, like a shameful creature. Hundreds of years ago, our nation put those considered less than human in shackles. Less than 100 years ago, we relegated them to the other side of town. Today, we put them in cages. Once released, they find that a heavy and cruel hand has been laid upon them. Brave New World. One might imagine that a criminal defendant, when brought before the judge, or when meeting with his attorney for the first time, would be told of the consequences of a guilty plea or conviction. He would be told that, if he pleads guilty to a felony, he will be deemed unfit for jury service and automatically excluded from juries for the rest of his life. He would also be told that he could be denied the right to vote. In a country that preaches the virtues of democracy, one could reasonably assume that being stripped of basic political rights would be treated by judges and court personnel as a serious matter indeed. Not so. When a defendant pleads guilty to a minor drug offense, nobody will likely tell him that he may be permanently forfeiting his right to vote as well as his right to serve on a jury, two of the most fundamental rights in any modern democracy. He will also be told little or nothing about the parallel universe he is about to enter, one that promises a form of punishment that is often more difficult to bear than prison time, a lifetime of shame, contempt, scorn, and exclusion. In this hidden world, discrimination is perfectly legal. As Jeremy Travis has observed, in this brave new world, punishment for the original offense is no longer enough. One's debt to society is never paid. Other commentators liken the prison label to the mark of Cain and characterize the perpetual nature of the sanction as internal exile. Myriad laws, rules, and regulations operate to discriminate against ex-offenders and effectively prevent their reintegration into the mainstream society and economy. These restrictions amount to a form of civic death and send the unequivocal message that they are no longer part of us. Once labeled a felon, the badge of inferiority remains with you for the rest of your life, relegating you to a permanent second-class status. Consider, for example, the harsh reality facing a first-time offender who pleads guilty to felony possession of marijuana. Even if the defendant manages to avoid prison time by accepting a generous plea deal, he may discover that the punishment that awaits him outside the courthouse doors is far more severe and debilitating than what he might have encountered in prison. A task force of the American Bar Association described the bleak reality facing a petty drug offender this way. The offender may be sentenced to a term of probation, community service, and court costs. Unbeknownst to this offender, and perhaps any other actor in the sentencing process, as a result of his conviction, he may be ineligible for many federally funded health and welfare benefits, food stamps, public housing, and federal educational assistance. His driver's license may be automatically suspended, and he may no longer qualify for certain employment and professional licenses. If he is convicted of another crime, he may be subject to imprisonment as a repeat offender. He will not be permitted to enlist in the military, or possess a firearm, or obtain a federal security clearance. If a citizen, he may lose the right to vote. If not, he becomes immediately deportable. Despite the brutal, debilitating impact of these collateral consequences on ex-offenders' lives, courts have generally declined to find that such sanctions are actually punishment for constitutional purposes. As a result, judges are not required to inform criminal defendants of some of the most important rights they are forfeiting when they plead guilty to a felony. In fact, judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys may not even be aware of the full range of collateral consequences for a felony conviction. Yet these civil penalties, although not considered punishment by our courts, often make it virtually impossible for ex-offenders to integrate into the mainstream society and economy upon release. Far from collateral, these sanctions can be the most damaging and painful aspect of a criminal conviction. Collectively, these sanctions send the strong message that now that you have been labeled, you are no longer wanted. You are no longer part of us, the deserving. Unable to drive, get a job, find housing, or even qualify for public benefits, many ex-offenders lose their children, their dignity, and eventually their freedom, landing back in jail after failing to play by the rules that seem hopelessly stacked against them. The churning of African Americans in and out of prisons today is hardly surprising, given the strong message that is sent to them that they are not wanted in mainstream society. In Frederick Douglass's words, "Men are so constituted that they derive their conviction of their own possibilities largely from the estimate formed of them by others. If nothing is expected of a people, that people will find it difficult to contradict that expectation." More than 100 years later, a similar argument was made by a woman contemplating her eventual release into a society that had constructed a brand new legal regime designed to keep her locked out 50 years after the demise of Jim Crow. "Right, now I'm in prison," she said. "Like, society kicked me out. They're like, okay, the criminal element. We don't want them in society. We're going to put them in prisons. Okay, but once I get out, then what do you do? What do you do with all these millions of people that have been in prison and been released? I mean, do you accept them back? Or do you keep them as outcasts? And if you keep them as outcasts, how do you expect them to act?" Remarkably, the overwhelming majority of ex-offenders struggle mightily to play by the rules and to succeed in a society seemingly hell-bent on excluding them. Like their forebears, they do their best to survive, even thrive, against all odds. No place like home. The first question on the minds of many released prisoners as they take their first steps outside the prison gates is where they will sleep that night. Some prisoners have families eagerly awaiting them, families who are willing to let their newly released relatives sleep on the couch, floor, or extra bed indefinitely. Most, however, desperately need to find a place to live, if not immediately, at least soon. After several days, weeks, or months of sleeping in your aunt's basement or on a friend's couch, a time comes when you are expected to fend for yourself. Figuring out how exactly to do that is no easy task, however, when your felony record operates to bar you from any public housing assistance. As one young man with a felony conviction explained in exasperation, "I asked for an application for Section 8. They asked me if I had a felony. I said yes. They said, well, then this application isn't for you." This young man had just hit his first brick wall coming out of prison. Housing discrimination against people branded felons, as well as suspected criminals, is perfectly legal. During Jim Crow, it was legal to deny housing on the basis of race, through restrictive covenants and other exclusionary practices. Today, discrimination against felons, criminal suspects, and their families is routine among public and private landlords alike. Rather than racially restrictive covenants, we have restrictive lease agreements, barring the new undesirables. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988, passed by Congress as part of the war on drugs, called for strict lease enforcement and eviction of public housing tenants who engage in criminal activity. The act granted public housing agencies the authority to use leases to evict any tenant, household member, or guest engaged in any criminal activity on or near public housing premises. In 1996, President Clinton, in an effort to bolster his tough-on-crime credentials, declared that public housing agencies should exercise no discretion when a tenant or guest engages in criminal activity, particularly if it is drug-related. In his 1996 State of the Union address, he proposed "one strike and you're out" legislation, which strengthened eviction rules and strongly urged that drug offenders be automatically excluded from public housing based on their criminal records. He later declared, "If you break the law, you no longer have a home in public housing. One strike and you're out." That should be the law everywhere in America. In its final form, the Act, together with the Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act of 1998, not only authorized public housing agencies to exclude automatically and evict drug offenders and other felons, it also allowed agencies to bar applicants believed to be using illegal drugs or abusing alcohol, whether or not they had been convicted of a crime. These decisions can be appealed, but appeals are rarely successful without an attorney, a luxury most public housing applicants cannot afford.
Okay, we did not finish all of the section No Place Like Home. We'll pick up next week in response to the new legislation and prodding by President Clinton. That's what we'll pick up at for next Friday as we keep chugging along. Katherine, Massey Book Club, Context of White Supremacy. If you have thoughts, observations on the second chunk of the text, the number again, 716. Make sure I give out the number correctly. 716. Woo, I'm having a long Friday. Make sure I'll do my email first as I get my brain computer back in. untiljustice@gmail.com. untiljustice@gmail.com. And you can give us a jingle if you have commentary to share. 720-716-7300. The code 564943 pound. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. Alrighty, let's see. I will finish up email number 2 and then get our other folks who dialed in as well. Let's see. Email number 2, end of an era. Supreme Court has now closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias at every stage of the criminal justice process, from stops and searches to plea bargaining and sentencing. The system of mass incarceration is now, for all practical purposes, thoroughly immunized from claims of racial bias. Metaphors and more metaphors. I can't help but think of the book Club Text Cased by Isabel Wilkerson, third worst book of all time currently. New Jim Crow is the fourth worst book of all time, so they are certainly close. I'm almost tempted to go back and reread Cased to look for similarities, maybe even plagiarism. They are very similar texts. I have thought that frequently, that whole undercased, like, yes, there are a lot of similarities between these two books. But I don't think I could stomach a second read. Here. You could that's something the bot could do, especially for some they're sophisticated enough. You could upload a whole PDF of both books, and the bot could look for, similar sentences, similar phrases, all of that. I might even do it next week and see what it says. The Cruel Hand. Make sure I got it. We feel ourselves to be not only deeply injured but grossly misunderstood. Our white countrymen do not know us. They are strangers and our character, ignorant of our capacity, oblivious to our history and progress, and are misinformed. as to the principles and ideas that control and guide us as people. Frederick Douglass, in a statement on behalf of delegates to the National Colored Convention 1853, I have nothing but admiration for Mr. Douglass. The torture he endured is hard to imagine. His efforts combating racism are heroic. That being said, victims guaranteed qualified. White people 1853 or 2023 are not ignorant about enslaved Negroes, coloreds, Negroes, African Americans, black people anywhere in the known universe. True. Although northern slavery had been abolished, every black person was still presumed a slave by law. Slavery may have died, but for thousands of blacks, the badge of slavery lived on. Slavery never died. Is that not the reason for all the discussion of the 13th Amendment? And other than slave tags, I'm not sure what she means by badge of slavery. Sounds like you're a victim of white supremacy. Like, criminal freed from prison has scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a freed slave or black person living free in Mississippi at the height of Jim Crow. This is the second time that the author has compared victims in the 1800s with those today. I think she does it many times throughout this text. I've heard many people for years brag about those comparisons as though they are very impressed. Something about this seems incorrect. Freed slaves had more rights and respect than a black person in Mississippi living under so-called Jim Crow? Question. You just said in the previous section that a black person at that time could be snatched up at any time and made a slave regardless of their background. Hey, didn't we read Solomon Northup, 12 years of slave, kidnapped and sold and stolen and all of that? This seems manipulative, done in order to strengthen her premise without any evidence. These sorts of, they are hypothetical metaphors. Like, I don't think you can, I guess you could look at the laws that govern their life, but when you really get down, if we're talking, she's saying so-called during the height of so-called Jim Crow, so what, 19, I wouldn't even know what are we talking about? Like, after Reconstruction, like 1890s? I don't think that would be fun to be a black person at that time in Mississippi. What are we talking about? 1920s? When would be, wherever you think it would be worse there. So here, in comparison to, and again, what does any of this, okay, so your treatment is going to be, we'll put it on a scale of A to B. So if A is the worst, if you're going to be treated A plus bad in the 1910s, you're going to be treated kind of B plus. They don't get too bad on you during the 1800s, and then now it's kind of a C. What has all of this gotten us in terms of how we are to understand racism, white supremacy? I don't even and even the overarching theme seems to be it's bad to be black at any point in there. It's bad to be a victim of white supremacy, and you can be snatched and caged anytime over that 200-year span. That would seem to be the overarching theme, unless I missed it. Let's see. I do think it's manipulative as well, because that's another one. It doesn't really require any data. She can just talk and, kind of emotionally, oh, yeah, that's right. All this stuff is a long time ago. How do you know? 4, criminals, it turns out, are the one social group in America we have permission to hate in colorblind America. Criminals are the new whipping boys. They are entitled to no respect and little moral concern. Like the colors in the years following emancipation, criminals today are deemed a characterless and purposeless people deserving our collective scorn and contempt. Heavy and cruel hand has been laid upon them. This passage is just foul. Racist white supremacists have never required permission to hate black people. Maybe they restrict what they say at times to when they are only around other white people. Over the last 70 years, We have race soldiers on tape espousing racist diatribes against all black people with or without criminal records, even Magic Johnson. And at every level, presidents, politicians, enforcement officials, school boards, store clerks, doctors, nurses, they did not ask for any permission. Moreover, they have never needed permission to terrorize black people. The cruel hand, another silly metaphor, is this a subtle way of disassociating white people from their evil deeds? They sure have made a ton of movies about hands that are separated from the body enacting horror and terror. See Creepy Severed Hand in cinema. Oh yeah, they do a lot of that. I do think it's another one of those of, she has lots of those, what was it? People perhaps politically connected to power, or however she phrased it, but she has lots of those lines where we're not directly calling out white people. Even all of that, no. White people. And that passage especially, criminals are the one social group in America we have permission to hate. Criminals? Psh, I know we got permission to hate Obama. I haven't seen that one, so we scratched that. I know we got permission to hate OJ. Seen that one. Got it. Black people in general. Come on. Come on. Like, that one I had to give a hard look to. Brave New World. Nobody likely tell him that he may be permanently forfeiting his right to vote, as well as his right to serve on a jury. A lifetime of shame, contempt, scorn, exclusion, discrimination is perfectly legal in this brave new world. Punishment, debt to society is never paid. The mark of Cain. Frederick Douglass's words: men are so constituted that they derive their conviction of their own possibilities largely from the estimate formed of them by others. If nothing is expected of a people, that people will find it difficult to contradict that expectation. The author wrote most of this section as a general discussion of felons, regardless of racial classification. However, I think it would be appropriate to at least point out that lots of data confirms that black felons are far worse than white ones after release, including life expectancy. This is particularly important since she is trying to make the case for the new Jim Crow and supposedly centering the experiences of black males in her argument. Is this another example of deception by omission? I find it interesting her use of quotes from these famous deceased victims. Frederick Douglass. See, it's hard out here if you're a black felon. A critical examination of black male reentry. J.M. Williams, 2019. I was even thinking as we were reading that George Steinbrenner, the Yankees owner, white man, wasn't he a convicted felon? Yes, he got a pardon. So yes, it is a different world if you are a white felon than Leroy. No place like home. This young man had just hit his first brick wall coming out of prison, automatically ineligible for public housing assistance for at least 5 years. Instead of using a metaphor, it should be called population dislocation. Great point. It's not a brick wall. It's not an invisible wall. It's really that book, Emily Flitter, The White Wall. You ran into white people directly, indirectly, or white people who hired non-white people and told them, don't you be giving out no help to them black people. They check the box. You tell them, beat it. President Clinton, if you break the law, you no longer have a home in public housing. One strike and you're out. That should be the law everywhere in America. Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act of 1998. Without housing, people can lose their children. The odds that he would have been convicted of drug possession would have been extremely low if he were white. But President Clinton is no racist. He's an ally. C.O.W.S. guest, Kenneth O'Reilly, author of Nixon's Piano and Racial Matters. Much obliged. We will pick up the rest for next week. Let's see. The number again, 720-716-7300. The code 564943 pound. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. Let's see. Victim in New Jersey, our caller at 565962. If y'all have commentary on the second portion, line should be open. Proceed.
Yeah, I just had a couple of things. I know we just got started in chapter 4, the cruel hand, but already the pronouns, the we's and the us and the are and all of that, lumping us together with the system, and there's none of that. And then the only thing that I really had that turned out to me was when she's talking about criminals, it turns out are the one social group in America we have permission to hate. I think that is, again, some lazy scholarship, and it's not accurate because when you think about criminals, you think about black people. So to say that criminals are, as a blanket statement, gets us to hate everyone, I don't find that accurate at all. And what came to mind is, as someone who lived in the racially restricted area of Colorado Springs, during the time of Columbine, I remember going to high school and them idolizing the trench coat mafia and wearing all of the dark clothes and being called Columbiners. That didn't seem like criminal hate to me. And that's all I have.
The trench coat mafia. I love it. I love it. It very, very different being classified as white. The trench coat mafia, which we also covered on the Katherine Massey Book Club extensively. Woo. And even had Michael Scholes as a guest on the program. So, I mean, we did our work. I forgot. I generally try when there are major revisions, I try to get those as soon as the section ends so then people can comment if something stands out. I forgot there was additional revision in the second audio segment. Not as big as the one we heard in the first section, but get that in really quick. So the 2010 version, I thought this was important. Even though it's tiny, it is still significant. So this is right at the end of the section, the end of an era. Basically the last page of that subsection before you get to chapter 4, the cruel hand. So the paragraph, the Supreme Court has now closed the courthouse doors. I'm just skipping down to about the second sentence. The system of mass incarceration is now, for all practical purposes, thoroughly immunized from claims of racial bias. Staggering racial disparities in the drug war continue but rarely make the news. Now, you didn't hear in the audio because she switched it around, but the 2010 version continues. The Obama administration has indicated it supports abolition of the 100-to-1 disparity in sentencing for crack versus powder cocaine, the most obvious and embarrassing example of racial bias in a system that purports to be colorblind. That gave me pause because that sounds like wink, wink. We just lie and say, oh yeah, we colorblind, we blind. How many fingers I'm holding up? Oh, I can't even see. How many you holding up? 12, 52? I don't know. I can't see. Wink, wink. We blind. Wink, wink. We can't even see nothing, man. You got my glasses? That's what it sounded like to me. Like she knows they're lying. And then when somebody looked at it, they said, you better take that part out. You don't want to do that. So they took that out for the 2012 because you didn't hear it. Now, this is what they put in. So I'm going to pick up at the same point. The system, this is 2020, 10th anniversary edition. The system of mass incarceration is now, for all practical purposes, thoroughly immunized from claims of racial bias. Staggering racial disparities in the drug war continue but rarely make the news. Changes. One recent development that did make the news was President Obama's decision to sign a legislation reducing the 100-to-1 disparity in sentencing for crack versus powder cocaine to 18-to-1, a small step in the right direction. Under the new law, it takes 28 grams of crack cocaine to net a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence, while it still takes selling 500 grams of powdered cocaine to net the same sentence. There should be no disparity. The ratio should be 1-to-1, and then it goes back to the other. Now, as I said, because that sentence about a system that purports to be colorblind has been redacted. That is no longer in the 2012 paperback, it's no longer in the 10th anniversary edition, and it's no longer in the revised audiobook. I think somebody, hey, that's kind of working against your thesis if you're saying it's colorblind. We're not colorblind. This is all very intentional. You should have picked a new title and got accurate information to go along with your new title. Let's see. Victim in New Jersey. Other folks, *61. Victim in New Jersey. Did you have commentary?
Yeah, Gus. So there was a statement in the book that she said. She alluded to that greater confinement. What was waiting for people who was in greater confinement. This new Jim Crow that she's framing, greater confinement was in a sense better for what was awaiting them. I'm like, how did she come to that conclusion? Because I know people in greater confinement would take the deal of being able to vote to have the freedom. That right there really didn't make any real sense to me. So I just want to know how does she even come to like such a conclusion? Because I'm in greater confinement. I'm like, okay, Mrs. Alexander, you've been in greater confinement. Has your husband told you that not being able to vote, being banned from ever being on the jury, and because most people don't even know the importance, or really don't understand the importance of jury duty. A lot of people that I know, they don't really want to, do jury duty. They go out of their way to get from serving, jury duty. So, I think Leroy would take that deal any day. Not be in greater confinement. Okay, I can't sit on a jury. So what? I want my freedom. So I was like, she could have executed whatever point he was trying to make. She could have did that a little better. So if this book was to get a grade, was it meaning that was any law change? Are we any closer from dismantling the new Jim Crow? I know here in New Jersey they do have an expungement, like you can get your record expunged. I'm not sure if is nationwide. I do know federally. I know that if you have a federal charge, then it's nothing that they can do for you. So you would basically have to get a presidential pardon if you have federal cases. But what was the impact of this book? Other than like you said, you hear people referring to this book. Rated is, what's the grade? Was these changes due to her book? So I mean, I would love to see any, just any data, any feedback, any if any states made any adjustment to their criminal justice system and how they execute, how they prosecute, did this book have any impact, thinking of do this nationwide, be something like to know. But yeah, so again, I think Leroy give up sitting in a jury box where he'll rather have his freedom. I could be incorrect.
Much obliged, victim in New Jersey. I think they have a lot of black people who do not have a criminal record, no felonies, no convictions, and they still figure that's what we've been talking about in this book, right? She had a whole chapter or subsection on that with the defending all white juries. So, and I already told you, Henry Wade, you got white prosecutors who have whole manuals and codes about this is how we go about making sure we have all white juries every time. We don't want not a speck of color up there, so we can go about the business of faking and fabricating all these convictions on black people who haven't done anything. That's Henry Wade, and that went on for decades. So let's see, the portion specifically about the how did she, I guess, determine how difficult or what it's like to take that plea deal. I'll read folks the sentence. It's right at the beginning of the section, Brave New World. It's once labeled a felon, the badge of inferiority remains with you for the rest of your life, relegating you with a permanent second-class status. Consider, for example, the harsh reality facing a first-time offender who pleads guilty to a felony possession of marijuana. Favorite, even if the defendant manages to avoid prison time by accepting a generous plea deal, he may discover that the punishment awaits him outside the courthouse doors is far more severe and debilitating than what he might have encountered in prison. A task force for the American Bar Association described the bleak reality facing a petty drug offender this way. And every being denied food stamps and welfare and public housing and educational assistance, and you got to check the box so you might not get a job and all of that. At least from my understanding, I didn't hear anything about no solitary confinement. I didn't hear anything about no getting shanked in the mess hall. Now, a lot of things can happen to you when you do not have finances and they done branded you a felon, black one at that, and you don't have finances, you don't have housing. Lots of bad things can happen to you. In fact, you can end up back in greater confinement, which she talked about. That is still not quite the same, as I said, being in greater confinement. Not great situation, but I don't know if yeah, I could go with that. I don't know if I could say that that is, but particularly far more severe. Like, really? Is that far more severe than being? I don't know. Like I said, it's a whole lot of black people. They don't have no record, and they still won't let you serve on the jury. So 6 in one hand, half dozen in the other for some of this. I guess wait a minute, even before I get back, the section on, and the impact. I think she might have shared a teaspoon about the impact of this book in the 10th anniversary edition, in the preface that we read, in terms of some prosecutors may be looking at things different, or differences in how they approach drug prosecutions, or whatever the case may be. But I think she's talked about some of that, or she wrote about, and we heard some of that in the 10th anniversary preface. I certainly don't think it's been enough, which she would say And yeah, we have not solved the problem, not even gotten close. So yeah, but I think she at least did address a teaspoon of that in the newest book. Let's see. Let me get email number 3 really quick. Third email. Hi, Gus Cow's audience. You are correct. Miss Alexander would not be the author's married name. Excuse me. You are correct. Mr. Alexander would not be the author's married name, so she's probably not Mrs. Alexander. I looked up her husband. As the chatbot said, he also has a white parent. Really? Now, I don't remember like looking as deeply because I obviously read on Michelle Alexander. I thought Carter Stewart had 2 black parents. I could be totally misinformed, but I thought he had 2 black parents. I'll double check. I cannot verify this. There are a few pictures online of the man who is said to be his father, and none of a white woman called Isabel Stewart with the man who's supposed to be his father, according to the chatbot. I was curious about the survey on people who think of when they imagine a drug user, the methodology. Study, a 1995 National Public Opinion Survey designed to elicit the public's mental image of a drug user. Sampling approach, not fully documented in the new Jim Crow, but the study is described as a general population survey of U.S. adults. Given the period, this would almost certainly have been a probability telephone survey, but the book does not specify. Data collection mode. Interviewer administered almost certainly by telephone. Question format. Single open-ended prompt. Respondents were asked to close their eyes, imagine a drug user, and describe the person. Response capture. Interviewers recorded the respondent's verbatim description. Coding procedure. Researchers code descriptions into categorical variables, most importantly, race, but also gender, age, if mentioned. Outcome variable, the race assigned to the imagined drug user based on the coded description. Analytic purpose, to measure implicit stereotype activation by examining the racial identity respondents spontaneously associated with drug user. Even in 1995, if you asked me the same question, I would automatically imagine a white person. But ask what color I think people who take meth or cocaine, white. Weed, black, unless I've been misinformed. Lots of white people use the wacky tobacco. Again, they did legalize. Washington State, Colorado leading the way. These are not exactly states known for their dark populations. Just saying. The original survey concluded, courtesy of chatbot, that Americans hold a racialized mental image of drug users, disproportionately black. It did not extend this to claims about policing, sentencing, or structural racism. That was Michelle Alexander's conclusion. Another deliberate attempt to confuse black people. The police do not need to image what a drug dealer or taker looks like if they are doing their job properly, and Michelle Alexander is smart enough to understand this. The study's authors concluded, based on their review and analysis of the empirical evidence, that the Seattle Police Department's decisions to focus so heavily on crack to the near exclusion of other drugs and to concentrate its efforts on outdoor drug markets in downtown areas. Woo, downtown is the worst. I'm talking about downtown Seattle, and it's always been like, there's like no point in the last like 20 years that I can think of. So, downtown is peaceful. We can go. Matter of fact, look. Downtown Seattle is so bad. Drugs and all the rest of it, and it ain't all the black people piled up in downtown Seattle. Downtown Seattle is so bad. The McDonald's during the Rona, they closed the seating inside and it never reopened. This is the McDonald's at 3rd and Pine. It's so bad, they nicknamed it McStabbies. They bolted the place up. You can only go and order at the window. This is not a joke. You can look online. They got articles in the Seattle Times about this and all that. Downtown has been horrible like forever. And I do not see any signs of improvement at all. Continuing. For the drug usage and continuing. Outdoor drug markets in downtown areas rather than drug markets located in indoors or in predominantly white communities reflect a racialized conception of the drug problem. The Seattle Police Department's focus on black and Latino individuals and on the drug most strongly associated with blackness suggests that law enforcement policies and practices are predicated on the assumption that the drug problem is, in fact, black and Latino one, and that crack, the drug most strongly associated with urban blacks, is the worst. She has a bold-faced print, not colorblind, which so many of her portions of her book say that. Again, I'd say for Seattle, they don't even have, she should have maybe put that in. Like, man, she can say a racially mixed city of Seattle. Forget that, man. I'm a Seattle resident, 206, man. Ain't even no black people here. How is it looking? Ain't even 10% of the black population here black. How is that? Like, that's not even like we just think of that. We're looking for Leroy. That's what this is. Ain't no way in the world. Here ain't no black people. Not even 10% of the population, and the population of black people has been dropping, so percentage-wise. So, come on. Let's see. Let's nab a few of my quick notes, and we'll do it. She did mention that word dignity in there. I heard Mr. Fuller. What's the difference between dignified slave and all the rest of it? Especially, it's no difference if they can snatch you up even if you are not a slave, and we say you is a slave, and that's that, Leroy. Now pick that cotton. How much dignity I got now. Solomon Northup. Let's see. She said less than 100 years ago, we regulated them to the other side of town. Today, we put them in cages. She said, trying to distance. I don't want to directly indict my mom, white people, see if I can camouflage it so I'm not talking tough on them. Come on. When she said those released from prison on parole can be stopped and searched by police for any reason or no reason at all, that's people classified as black, period. Really, anywhere in the world. What are you, really, stopped by enforcement officers, badge or no? What are you doing? Might have to ask you some questions. You looking suspicious around here. You up to no good? You breathing, so you up to no good. That's the whole system of white supremacy. Ahmaud Arbery, Corey Stingley, that's who I was thinking of, 16-year-old in Wisconsin who was summarily executed in a store, Waukesha, Wisconsin, I think specifically, where he was accused of stealing about $12 worth of items. And white people who didn't even work at the store. Talk about the chokehold. See, what is it? They didn't work at the store. They weren't security, and they weren't law enforcement. They choked Corey Stingley to death on the spot. Didn't even get arrested for it. So you can be stopped and executed just for breathing wrong, looking wrong, much less being a felon or you on probation or whatever else. Even, like I said, when she has to put a sentence like that in there, the most obvious and embarrassing example of racial bias in a system that purports to be colorblind, and you remove that sentence, like I said, to me, that's why I say these are lies. This is willful, deliberate deception. You know this is willful, deliberate, intentional white supremacy racism by people like your white mom, your white family, but you consistently, even, you don't even want to say white people. That's how we got all, everybody is indicted on this, not people classified as white. They That's why we got all that and beating up on civil rights attorneys and such. Even get a jab in Obama because he didn't do enough, or the Congressional Black Caucus. It's so much of that throughout this book when you know what it is. A system that lies and says it's colorblind when we're deliberately targeting black people. It's 5 black people in Seattle. We're going to get them all arrested today. That ain't colorblind. Like, get out of here. Let's see. Anything else? We'll pick it up, I reckon, for next Friday as we chug along. Should be here Saturday, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific for the Counter-Racist Weekly Review. We'll have updates and such, next guests, all that good stuff as we chug through the book. I have to ponder on that. I think it was Victim in New Jersey who said, should she have given us some details? She mentioned her hubby. He's a prosecutor. You're doing all this talk about prosecutors. They're a big part of this here book. Should she have given us some details about her hubby's approach to all of this? Does his conduct mirror what she's talked about in the book and all the discretion? And does he lump people up with them felonies right quick and all the rest of it? That's how Carter Stewart does it too? I had to think about that one as we continue on in the book. Anywho, that Victim, yes, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. It's just something that's been kind of irritating to the black and brown. You know what I mean? I just, again, I know that she's not. I'm assuming that she's not aware of Wilson, Nellie Fuller's work, but they use a metaphor. The black and brown is like taking me out. If I had a request, I just said what she just said, non-white, because when you start to say black and brown, brown is not a race. There are people who could be classified as white within the grouping that's called brown. So it's just, are we talking about Jim Crow, or are we talking about Jim Crow that affected people it's black? What are we talking about? Just wish she would just focus on the targeted group, which is black people. But if you want to replace black and brown with non-white, that would be wonderful if she was, if she would have added that in her edition.
Here. Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And just because sometimes, and even the title of the book is The New Jim Crow. I don't think Jim Crow was focused on so-called brown people. That's black codes and such. That's what we're talking about. So let's stay focused on what the subject is. Even that portion that I read, the revision from the first audio segment today, where she had that intense focus on the treatment of black males who are labeled felons. If that's really important, why wasn't that in the original publication of the text, 2010? Why did it take you all that time to reflect that? I really need to hammer that home about how this impacts black males. I thought that was a part of the thesis of the book. That's why I said, to me, none of this strikes me as an authentic commitment to this subject matter, doing it correctly, accurately, or even honestly addressing the system of white supremacy racism. Nothing about this project seems like it is seriously, sincerely committed to any of those goals. But the black and brown, when she has repeatedly statements from today, where she says in New Jersey, 73% of all arrests were of black motorists. She didn't say black and brown, black motorists. If that's the case, if that's the way this is working out, and brown, Latino, that's not even a racial classification. Come on, man. Be accurate. And yes, if we got to get brown, non-white, accurate to what we are talking about. And even, especially if you're going to have every black person was still presumed a slave. You didn't say every black and brown person was presumed a slave. So come on, stay focused on what we're supposed to be talking about. And then non-white, I have to look to see if that term is even in the book here. Does she use it at all? Non-white? Is that in here? Is it in here? We'll be back tomorrow, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, as I do my word search to see if the term non-white, if I see if it's in the 2010 version or no, and then I'll double check as we move along to see if it's in the 2020 version. But either way, much obliged. Victim in New Jersey, as I said, nope, I thought it done searching, not done searching, still taking a gander. Either way, we'll be here Saturday, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Counter Racist Weekly Review, non-white, not in the 2010 version of the text. Words are important. This certainly does not seem like a very codified book at all. With that, sobriety would be best for the book we are reading for sure. Sobriety would be best. That said, Creator, we ask that you remind us, stop saying not all white people are racist. Even Bill Clinton? Come on. Remind us, stop name-calling people classified as black. Felon even. Name-calling. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice. Immediately. Cows signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
Nigga, you so brainwashed.
I'm a victim, brother.
No problem. You're a victim.
I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.